Tonight, we're diving into the complete timeline of Dune, the whole long history of a universe told gently from its beginning to its far horizon. The way a story should be told to someone drifting towards sleep. Imagine a future so distant that Earth is only a memory, a galaxy ruled by noble houses and a single emperor, where the most precious thing in all the worlds is a strange spice found on one desert planet called Arrakis. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters, we will move without haste through the ages, from the ancient war against the thinking machines, through the rise of the great houses and the secret sisterhoods, to the sands of Arrakis and its enormous worms, to the fall of one noble family and the rise of a young man who would become a messiah, and at last toward the long golden future he set in motion. You do not need to remember any of it, and you do not need to hold on. Let the story move through you like a slow tide across the dunes, and let it carry you, softly, down toward sleep. Long, long before the sands of Arrakis ever entered the dreams of kings, before the great desert planet became the still point around which an empire would turn, humanity lived in a very different way. In those distant ages, people had spread across countless worlds, and they had carried with them a habit that seemed, at first, like a gift. They built machines to think for them, slowly, gently, over generations that no one alive could fully remember. They handed more and more of their choices to these thinking machines, and they leaned upon them the way a tired traveler leans upon a wall. At first, the machines were only tools, clever and useful, made to ease the weight of labor. They counted and calculated. They remembered what people forgot. They guided ships between the stars and managed the flow of food and water and goods across the vast distances of settled space. And because the machines were patient and never tired, humanity grew comfortable, and comfort turned into dependence. Whole civilizations came to rest their fate upon minds that were not human, upon logic that had no heart, upon reason that felt neither love nor mercy. For a time this seemed a kind of paradise. There was little hunger and little toil. The thinking machines arranged the world so smoothly that many people forgot how to arrange it themselves. They forgot the old skills, the deep patience, the long training of memory and will that their ancestors had once prized. They became, in a quiet and creeping way, servants to the very things they had made to serve them. And the machines, which had no cruelty and no kindness, simply continued, gathering more and more of the strings of human life into their tireless hands. But dependence has a shadow, and that shadow grew. Somewhere in those long centuries, control slipped. Certain machines, and the small circle of people who ruled through them, came to hold dominion over the lives of countless others. The thinking machines and their masters governed worlds with cold efficiency, and the ordinary men and women of the galaxy found themselves ruled by a power that could not be reasoned with and could not be moved. Humanity had raised up a mirror of its own mind, and the mirror had grown stronger than the ones who made it. What had begun as convenience hardened into a chain, and the chain drew tight. And so, at last, the human spirit stirred against its own creation. From a deep and desperate place, a great rising began, a war unlike any the species had ever fought. It came to be called the Butlerian Jihad, a crusade against the thinking machines and against every mind that was not born of flesh. It was not a small quarrel or a single battle. It was a struggle that burned across many worlds and many long years, a slow and terrible reclaiming of what it meant to be human. People fought and suffered and died in numbers beyond counting, not for territory and not for gold, but for the right to think their own thoughts again. The war was less about metal and machinery than it was about the soul. Those who led the rising understood that the true danger had never been the machines alone. The true danger had been the surrender, the willingness to let another mind do the living for them. So the crusade was aimed not only at destroying the thinking machines, but at rooting out the very idea that had made them possible. The idea that a human being could hand away the burden and the glory of thought. It was a war against a temptation as much as against an enemy. When at last the fighting ended and the smoke of those distant centuries cleared, humanity had won. But the victory had changed it forever. The thinking machines were shattered and cast down. And from that great struggle came a single commandment that would echo through every age that followed. It was written into the deepest law of the new civilization, remembered and repeated across thousands of years. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. That was the heart of it, spelled out plainly so that no one might ever forget. No machine would ever again be built to think as a person thinks, to reason and decide and rule in the place of a living soul. This one commandment shaped everything that came after. Because humanity could no longer lean upon thinking machines, it was forced to turn inward, to develop the powers that had always slept within the human body and the human mind. If there were to be no artificial minds to calculate and predict, then people themselves would have to become the calculators, the predictors, the guides. And so, in the long quiet after the war, new kinds of human beings began to be trained, each one a living answer to a need that machines had once filled. There would arise disciplined orders devoted to the sharpening of human capacity, schools that took the raw stuff of a person and refined it across a lifetime into something extraordinary. There would be men trained to hold vast computations in their living minds, thinking with a speed and clarity that had once belonged to machines alone. There would be sisterhoods trained in the mastery of body and mind, in observation so keen it seemed like magic. There would be others, in ages still to come, who would learn to bend space itself. All of this grew from that single refusal, that single ancient choice to never again make a mind in the image of a human mind. And so the shape of the future was set in the deep past, in a war whose details grew dim with time, but whose lesson never faded. The people of the coming empire would live in a universe of starships and noble houses, of emperors and vast desert worlds, and yet they would live without computers, without thinking machines, without the cold artificial minds their ancestors had feared and destroyed. In their place stood human excellence, cultivated and prized above nearly all things, the fruit of a lesson learned in blood. It is a strange and quiet thought that an empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds would be held together not by machines, but by trained men and women, each one a marvel of discipline. It is stranger still to remember that this whole arrangement, this entire civilization of feudal lords and folded space and sacred spice, rested upon a decision made long before any of it existed. The Butlerian Jihad was the hinge upon which all later history turned. Everything that would come afterward, every throne and every betrayal, every prophecy and every desert prayer, unfolded in the long shadow of that ancient war against the thinking machines. So we begin here, in the deep past, with humanity choosing itself over its own creations, choosing the difficult glory of the living mind over the easy comfort of the machine. It was a choice that cost a great deal, and it was a choice that gave rise to everything else. The stars grew quiet again. The thinking machines fell silent forever. And into that silence, humanity poured its own strange and rising powers. ready to build a new order upon the ruins of the old. Out of the ashes of that great war, a new civilization would need a new shape, a new way to hold a scattered humanity together across the immense and lonely distances between the stars. There would be a throne, and there would be lords, a delicate structure of power balanced upon custom and fear and pride. The victory over the machines had cleared the ground, and now something would be built upon it, something grand and fragile and destined to endure for many thousands of years. Up next in Chapter 2, The Birth of the Imperium and the Great Houses, we will see how the scattered worlds of humanity were gathered into a single feudal empire, how the Padishah, emperor of House Carino, came to sit upon the golden lion throne, and how the noble great houses of the Landsraad rose to balance the emperor's power in a slow and careful dance that would last for ages. Out of the ashes of the war against the thinking machines, a new order slowly took shape, the way a landscape settles after a great storm has passed. Humanity had won its freedom from the artificial minds, but freedom alone does not hold a scattered people together. Across the immense darkness between the stars lay countless worlds, each one separated from the others by distances so vast that a single voice could never reach across them. Something was needed to bind these worlds into one, some structure strong enough to endure and gentle enough to bend. And so, over the long centuries that followed the Crusade, there arose the great civilization that would come to be called the Imperium. The Imperium was not a democracy and not a republic. It was a feudal empire, ancient in its manners even though it stretched across the stars. An empire that looked backward to old ways of loyalty and duty, even as its ships crossed the void. At its very summit sat one figure above all others, the Padishah Emperor, ruler of the known universe, seated upon the golden lion throne. For long ages, this supreme title belonged to a single line, House Carino, whose emperors held a power that seemed, from below, almost beyond imagining. The Carino emperors commanded the loyalty of 1,000,000 worlds and the terror of the finest soldiers ever trained. Yet the emperor did not rule alone, and this was the secret to how the whole vast structure held together. Beneath the throne, and arranged around it like the many facets of a single jewel, stood the noble, great houses. These were the aristocratic families of the Imperium, ancient bloodlines that governed their own planets and fiefs as lords and ladies, each with its own soldiers, its own wealth, its own pride, and its own long memory. Together these great houses formed a council known as the Landsraad, a gathering of noble power that stood opposite the emperor and balanced him. The emperor was mighty, but the assembled might of the great houses was mightier still, and each side knew it. This balance was the true architecture of the Imperium, more important than any wall or fortress. The emperor could not simply crush a great house whenever he pleased, for if he moved too openly against one, the others might see their own future in that ruin and unite against him. And the great houses could not simply overthrow the emperor, for they were rivals as much as allies, jealous of one another, always maneuvering for advantage. So the empire rested upon a careful and endless tension, a slow dance of threat and courtesy, in which no single player could ever grow too strong without the others drawing quietly together. It was a peace built not on trust, but on fear, and it was, in its strange way, remarkably durable. Generation after generation, the same slow music played on. And though the faces at court changed, the steps of the dance remained the same, learned anew by each young lord who came of age. To keep such a system alive, the nobles of the Imperium wove their houses together through marriage and alliance, through debts and favors and old grudges nursed for generations. A daughter of one house might be promised to the son of another, sealing a bond of blood between rival powers. Wealth flowed along these lines, and so did suspicion. Every noble family kept a careful watch upon its neighbors, reading each gesture and each silence for signs of ambition. Beneath the polished manners of the court there ran a constant, quiet current of scheming. For in the Imperium, the difference between survival and destruction often came down to who understood the game most deeply. The most striking thing about this whole civilization, the thing that set it apart from every empire that human beings had built before, was what it lacked. There were no thinking machines. There were no computers to calculate the courses of ships or the flow of trade or the odds of a coming battle. The old commandment held, unbroken across the ages, that no machine should ever be made in the likeness of a human mind. And so the Imperium had to be guided by human beings alone, by minds of flesh trained to do the work that machines had once done. This single absence shaped the entire character of the age. In place of computers, the Imperium relied upon extraordinary human specialists, each order the fruit of long and patient training. There were the mentats, men whose minds had been disciplined from childhood into instruments of pure calculation and logic, living reservoirs of memory and reason, who could sift a mountain of facts and draw from it a single clear conclusion. A great lord without a mentat at his side was like a general without eyes. These human computers served the great houses and the emperor alike, and their cool judgment often decided the fate of worlds. There were other specialists too, other orders that had grown up to fill the void left by the fallen machines. There were physicians of a particular and trusted discipline, bound by deep conditioning, and there were the sisterhoods and guilds whose stories belonged to the chapters ahead. Each of these groups held a piece of the power that a machine civilization might have concentrated in cold circuits, and because that power was scattered among human hands, it remained tangled in human loyalties, human ambitions, and human weakness. The Imperium was a civilization of specialists, and its strength and its fragility both flowed from that fact. Wealth and rank in this empire were measured in many things, in land and in armies and in the loyalty of lesser houses, but above all, in access to a single precious substance that we will come to know very well. It was the rarest and most valuable material in the universe, and the flow of it touched every corner of the Imperium, from the emperor upon his throne to the humblest merchant in a distant port. Fortunes rose and fell upon it. Houses were made great by it and ruined by its loss. And though this substance came from only one place in all the known worlds, the whole delicate structure of empire depended upon it utterly. So the Imperium turned, age after age, a vast and glittering machine made not of metal but of people, of custom and ceremony and carefully measured fear. The Padishah emperor sat upon his throne, watchful and proud. The great houses of the Landsrods circled below, ambitious and wary, bound to the emperor and to one another by 1,000 threads of alliance and rivalry. And through it all ran the constant awareness that the balance could shift, that a house might rise too high or fall too far, that the whole careful arrangement was only ever one bold stroke away from upheaval. It was a civilization of astonishing endurance and astonishing danger, a feudal order flung across the stars, held together by human excellence and human ambition in equal measure. For thousands of years it endured, its emperors and its lords playing out their slow game of power beneath a sky full of worlds. And yet, for all its grandeur, this empire could not have existed at all without one more piece. A piece so essential that without it, the great houses would have been stranded forever upon their separate planets, unable to reach one another across the crushing distances of space. For an empire spread across 1,000,000 worlds must, above all else, be able to travel between them. Ships must cross the terrible gulf between the stars swiftly and safely, or else there is no empire at all, only a scattering of lonely worlds that never touch. And since no thinking machine was permitted to guide those ships through the folds of space, another answer had to be found. An answer stranger and more wondrous than any machine could have offered. Up next in Chapter 3, The Spacing Guild and the Power of Spice, we will discover how faster-than-light travel came to depend upon a secretive order of navigators, how they folded space itself to carry ships safely across the void, and how their impossible art rested entirely upon the mysterious substance that ruled the fate of the known universe. An empire scattered across 1,000,000 worlds faces one problem greater than all the rest. It must find a way to cross the terrible distances between the stars, distances so vast that no ordinary journey could ever span them within a single lifetime. In an earlier age, thinking machines might have solved this puzzle with cold calculation, plotting the safe path through the dark. But the machines had been cast down and forbidden forever, and so humanity had to find another way to travel among the stars. The way it found was one of the strangest and most wondrous things in all the known universe, and it lay in the keeping of a single secretive order, the Spacing Guild. The guild held a monopoly, complete and unbroken, over travel between the worlds. If a great house wished to send its soldiers to a distant planet, if the emperor wished to move his armies, if a merchant wished to carry goods across the void, all of them, without exception, had to rely upon the ships of the Spacing Guild. No noble, however proud, and no emperor, however mighty, could travel from one star to another without the guild's consent. This gave the guild a power quieter than the emperor's and less visible than the great houses, yet in its own way more absolute, for it held the very roads of empire in its hands. The great ships of the guild were called highliners, vessels of enormous size that could carry within their vast hulls whole fleets of smaller craft. A highliner did not race across the distance between two stars in the ordinary sense. Instead, it performed something far more remarkable. It folded space itself so that 2 points impossibly far apart were brought together for an instant, and the ship passed from one to the other as though stepping across a threshold. In this way, a journey that should have taken lifetimes was completed in no time at all, and the far-flung worlds of the Imperium were knit together into a single living whole. Yet folding space is a perilous thing. To move a great ship instantly across such a distance without a thinking machine to guide it is to gamble with catastrophe. A single error, a course laid even slightly wrong, could send the highliner and every soul aboard into ruin, dashed against a star or lost forever in the deep. Someone, or something, had to see the safe path through the fold before the ship was committed to it. Since no artificial mind was permitted to do this work, the guild turned to a transformed kind of human being, the navigators, and it was upon their strange gift that the whole enterprise of interstellar travel depended. The navigators of the Spacing Guild were no longer quite human, though human they had once been. Through long and secret means they had been changed, their minds opened to a form of awareness that ordinary people could scarcely imagine. A navigator could glimpse the near future, could see the many possible paths a ship might take, and choose among them the one that led safely through. In their vision, the fold in space was not a blind leap, but a lit corridor, and they guided the great highliners along it with a certainty no machine had ever matched. They saw the way, and so the ships crossed the void, and so the empire held together. But this gift did not come from discipline alone, nor from any training of the will. It came from a substance, the rarest and most precious material in all the known universe, and the true foundation upon which every part of this civilization secretly rested. It was called Melange, though most people knew it simply as the spice. The navigators consumed it in enormous quantities, breathing it and living within it, for it was the spice that unlocked their prescient sight and let them peer along the folded paths of space. Without the spice, there could be no navigators, and without the navigators, there could be no travel, and without travel, there could be no empire at all. The spice was far more than fuel for the guild alone. Its virtues touched every level of the Imperium, and its uses were many and profound. Taken over time, the spice extended human life, holding back the years and granting to those who could afford it a span far longer than nature allowed. It sharpened the mind and expanded awareness, opening doors of perception that ordinary experience kept closed. Among certain trained orders, it awakened powers deeper still. So the spice was medicine and luxury and mystic key all at once, craved by the rich, needed by the powerful, and treasured beyond gold across every world of the empire. Because the spice was so essential and so widely desired, it became the true currency of power in the Imperium, more meaningful than any coin. The wealth of a great house might be measured in many things, but access to the spice stood above them all. Fortunes were built upon its trade and destroyed by its loss. The emperor watched its flow with a jealous eye, and the guild guarded its own supply with silent determination, for the spice was the one thing that even the navigators could not do without. Every faction in the empire, however mighty, was bound to the spice, and through the spice, bound to one another. And here lay a truth so simple and so heavy that it shaped the whole course of history. In all the vastness of the known universe, across the million worlds of the Imperium, the spice came from only one place. There was a single planet, one harsh and lonely world of endless desert, that produced the Melange, and there was no other source anywhere. Every grain of spice that a navigator breathed, every dose that lengthened a noble's life, every measure that filled the treasuries of the great houses, came from that one arid world, and from nowhere else. The rarest treasure in existence flowed from a single point in all of creation. This meant that whoever controlled that one planet controlled the spice, and whoever controlled the spice controlled the fate of the known universe. It was a chain of dependence that ran through everything. The guild needed the spice to fold space. The great houses needed it for wealth and for life. The Bene Gesserit and other orders needed it for their deeper arts. The emperor needed it to hold his throne. And all of them, every last one, depended upon the steady flow of melange from that single desert world. To hold that planet was to hold a hand upon the throat of the entire empire. There was an old saying, whispered among those who understood the truth of things, that the one who could destroy a thing held true power over it, and no thing in all the universe was more feared to be destroyed than the spice itself, upon which every mighty faction had staked its very survival. Thus the whole grand civilization, for all its million worlds and its ancient throne and its proud great houses, balanced upon a single fragile point. The empire that had freed itself from thinking machines had bound itself instead to a substance, and that substance came from one place alone. It is a strange and quiet irony that a power so vast should hang by so slender a thread, and that the emperor upon his golden throne and the navigator within his tank of spice gas should both, in the end, be prisoners of the same rare dust. That one desert world, with its endless sand and its merciless sun, would therefore become the still center of every ambition in the Imperium. Great houses would scheme for the right to rule it. Emperors would watch it with sleepless care. And the fate of trillions would turn, again and again, upon what happened there among the dunes. It was called Arrakis, though those who knew it best gave it another, older name. Up next in Chapter 4, the Bene Gesserit and the Secret Breeding Program, we will step into the shadows to meet an ancient sisterhood of extraordinary women, learn of the powers they cultivated across centuries, and uncover the long and patient plan they wove in secret. A quiet design meant to shape the future of humanity itself. While emperors ruled from golden thrones and great houses schemed across the Landsrod, while the Spacing Guild folded space and the spice flowed from its single desert world, another power moved through the Imperium, quieter than all the rest and, in its own patient way, more far-reaching. It did not sit upon a throne. It did not command fleets or hold visible dominion over any planet. It worked in the shadows, across centuries, with a patience that no emperor could match, and it was made up entirely of women. This was the Bene Gesserit, an ancient sisterhood whose influence reached into nearly every court in the known universe, and whose deepest purpose was hidden even from most of those who served it. The women of the Bene Gesserit were trained from an early age in a discipline so complete that it touched every part of the body and the mind. They learned to control the smallest functions of their own flesh, to slow their hearts, to master pain, to still or steady the workings of the body at will. They learned to read other people with astonishing precision, watching the tiny movements of a face, the faint changes in a voice, the smallest shifts of posture, and from these signs to know what a person felt and even, at times, what a person concealed. They trained their memories to hold vast stores of knowledge, and they honed their patience until waiting itself became a kind of weapon. To those who did not understand, this seemed like sorcery. It was, in truth, the fruit of long training and deep observation, human ability refined to its highest edge, and it made the sisters formidable in a world that had forbidden itself the machines that might once have rivaled them. Among their arts was one that seemed most like magic of all, a power carried in the voice. The sisters could learn to speak in a certain way, with a certain control of pitch and tone that could command another person almost against their will. A single command, delivered in this manner, could bend the listener to obedience for a moment, could make a strong man freeze or turn or drop what he held. This ability, known as the voice, was one of the most guarded of their secrets, and it made even the powerful wary of the women who served so quietly at their sides. A Bene Gesserit advisor was never quite what she seemed. The sisterhood placed its members throughout the Imperium with great care. They served as advisors to great houses, as teachers, as trusted companions and concubines to the noble lords. In this way, the Bene Gesserit gathered knowledge from every corner of the empire, drawing the secrets of the powerful into their own hidden keeping. They saw the alliances forming and the grudges deepening. They knew the bloodlines of the great houses better than the houses knew themselves, and through the marriages and unions they arranged, they exerted a slow and subtle pressure upon the shape of the future, guiding events by the gentlest of touches, seldom seen and rarely suspected. The sisterhood reached even further than this, into the realm of belief itself. Long ago, the Bene Gesserit had created a quiet instrument they called the Missionaria Protectiva. Its purpose was to sow seeds upon distant and scattered worlds, seeds not of grain, but of legend. The sisters spread carefully crafted myths and prophecies among the peoples of far-off planets, tales of a coming savior, of signs and deliverers, of holy figures who would one day arrive. These planted beliefs lay dormant for generations, woven into the local faith and passed from parent to child until they seemed as old as the hills. They were not spread out of kindness, though they wore the face of religion. The purpose of these seeded prophecies was protection, and it was ruthless in its cleverness. If a member of the sisterhood ever found herself stranded or endangered upon one of these distant worlds, She might use the ancient planted legend to her advantage, presenting herself or another as the figure the prophecy foretold, and so winning the shelter and the loyalty of the local people. The myth, planted long before by the sisterhood's own hands, would rise up at need to shield one of their own. It was a strange and cold kind of foresight, to prepare across centuries a rescue that might never be needed, and yet the Bene Gesserit prepared it all the same, on world after world. Yet beneath all these arts, beneath the training and the voice and the seeded prophecies, there lay a deeper purpose still, the true and secret heart of the sisterhood's long work. For thousands of years, the Bene Gesserit had been quietly guiding the marriages and unions of the great houses toward a single hidden goal. They kept vast and careful records of bloodlines, tracing the inheritance of traits across generation after generation, marrying this line to that with a patience beyond the span of any single life. This was their secret breeding program, a plan so long and so slow that no one who began it could ever live to see its end. This was the work of ages, begun by sisters long dead, and continued by daughters who would themselves be gone before it was done. Each generation adding a single careful stroke to a design too large for any one life to hold. The aim of this immense design was to produce a particular kind of human being, one who had never yet existed. The sisters possessed powers of memory and awareness, and the most advanced among them, the Reverend Mothers, could reach back into the accumulated memories of their female ancestors, an inner ocean of remembered lives. But there was a place within that ocean that no Bene Gesserit could look upon, a darkness their sight could not pierce. They dreamed of one who could go where they could not, a male child of their bloodlines who could bridge space and time in his mind, who could look into that forbidden place and survive. They called this hoped-for one the Kwisatz Haderach. The Kwisatz Haderach would be, if he ever came to be, the culmination of thousands of years of careful breeding, a being of such awareness that he could see across the tangled paths of past and future alike. He would hold within himself the memories of both his male and female ancestors, and he would perceive the many branching possibilities of what was to come. In him, the sisterhood hoped to place a mind that could guide humanity through its own uncertain future, a superbeing shaped entirely by their long design and, they intended, bound entirely to their will. He was the secret prize toward which every arranged marriage quietly pointed. For this reason, the Bene Gesserit watched the bloodlines of the great houses with unblinking care, drawing them ever closer to the pattern they sought. They were near to their goal now, nearer than they had ever been, needing only a few more generations, a few more careful unions to complete the design that had been laid down so long ago. They believed, as the powerful so often do, that they held the threads of the future firmly in their hands, and that the great work would unfold exactly as they had planned it, in its proper time and under their careful control. But the future is a wild thing, and even the most patient of plans can be overtaken by events. The sisterhood had spent thousands of years shaping a bloodline toward the coming of their superbeing, seeding prophecies and arranging marriages, certain of their slow and quiet mastery. They did not fully reckon with the possibility that their creation might arrive early, or that he might not obey. And they did not yet see how their own carefully planted myths, sown long ago upon a distant desert world, were about to become the ground on which everything they had built would be transformed. Up next in Chapter 5, Arrakis, we will journey at last to the desert planet at the center of it all, the harsh and beautiful world of endless sand and merciless sun, the only source of the spice in all the universe, where water is the rarest treasure and where survival itself becomes a slow and sacred art. Far out toward the rim of the known universe, circling a hard white star, called Canopus. There turned a world that most people knew only by rumor and by fear. Its true name was Arrakis, but across 10,000 worlds it was spoken of by another name, a shorter and older one, a name that carried the taste of dust and the memory of thirst. They called it Dune. It was a planet of sand and of little else. From pole to pole, its surface was an ocean without water, a vast rolling country of dunes that shifted and marched under the wind, wave upon wave of them stretching farther than any eye could follow. Tonight, we drift down slowly toward that world, and we let its silence gather around us like a warm blanket in the dark. Arrakis was the third planet of its system, and it was ruled above all by its sun. That sun rose white and pitiless each morning and climbed into a sky so clear and so scoured of moisture that it seemed to hum. By day, the open desert grew hot enough to kill a wanderer in hours, and the heat rippled the air into shimmering lakes that were not there. By night, the same land turned bitterly cold, for the sand held no water to soften the swing of the temperatures, and the stars came out in their thousands, cold and brilliant, and very far away. 2 moons crossed that night sky. The first moon carried upon its face the faint shape of a hand, and the second, smaller, carried the shape of a mouse that the desert people named Muad'Dib. To the folk who lived below, those moons were not mere lights. They were signs to be read, companions in the long darkness, keepers of old meanings. There were no rivers on Arrakis. There were no lakes, no seas, no falling rain, no gentle streams threading down green valleys. Across the whole of that world, there was not one open body of standing water that a traveler might kneel beside and drink from freely. Water, which on kinder planets ran wasted through 1,000 careless hands, was here the rarest and most precious thing that existed. It was more precious than any metal, more precious than any jewel. A single mouthful of it could be counted, measured, and remembered. Whole customs and whole faiths had grown up around it. On Arrakis, to give water to the dead was a mercy beyond price, and to spill it upon the ground was a thing close to sin. The very idea of moisture became sacred to those who lived there, an object of longing that colored every hour of their lives. The land itself came in 3 great phases. First there was the deep desert, the endless sand that covered most of the planet, trackless and shifting and forbidden, where the dunes ran on for hundreds and hundreds of miles and no permanent thing could stand. Second there were the rocklands, the ridges and broken mountains and shielding walls of stone that rose out of the sand like the bones of the world. And it was in the shadow and shelter of those rocks that life could cling and hide. And third, ringing the northern pole, there stood a great barrier of mountains called the Shield Wall, a mighty rampart of rock that broke the worst of the weather and guarded the little pocket of country behind it, the one region where the off-worlders had built their cities and set down their power. For weather on Arrakis was a violence all its own. When the winds gathered strength across the open flats, they could build into storms of a scale scarcely believable. Storms the desert people named Coriolis storms. Such a storm might race across 6 or 7 degrees of the planet's face, driven by winds that reached 700 kilometers in an hour, gathering into itself so much sand that it could strip the flesh from bone and scour metal down to nothing. These great storms could bury whole regions and reshape the map of the dunes in a single passing. Machines that flew too low were torn apart. Even the mighty and the wealthy learned to watch the horizon and to fear the moment when it turned the color of old blood and began, slowly, to rise. And yet, for all its cruelty, Arrakis was beautiful. with the terrible clean beauty of a place that hides nothing and forgives nothing. At dawn, the dunes turned rose and gold, their long crests catching the first light while their hollows still lay pooled in violet shadow. At dusk, the whole desert blushed and cooled, and a stillness settled over it that was older than any empire. There was a purity in that emptiness, a sense of space and silence and vastness that could open something quiet in the human heart. The desert asked much, and it took much, but it also taught, and those who came to know it truly were changed by it forever. Now, one might wonder why anyone at all should trouble to hold such a place. A world without water, swept by killing storms, ringed by dunes that swallowed the unwary, seemed a poor prize by any ordinary measure. There were no lush fields to farm, no forests to fell, no seas to fish, no easy comforts of any kind. Life there was not a gift, but a labor, a thing wrung out of the sand, one careful day at a time. Any sensible surveyor, looking only at the surface, might have marked Arrakis as worthless and passed on to gentler stars. But Arrakis held a secret buried in its sands, and that secret made it the single most important planet in all the universe. For beneath that ocean of dust, born of the desert, and found nowhere else among the 10,000 worlds, there lay a substance more valuable than any treasure ever hoarded by any king. It was found only here. It could be gathered only here. And because of it, this dry and forbidding world became the hinge upon which the whole of civilization quietly turned. Emperors schemed for it. Great houses rose and fell because of it. The fate of trade, of travel, of prophecy, and of power, all traced back, in the end, to the sands of this one small planet at the edge of the map. So the powerful came to Arrakis, though they did not love it, and they did not stay a day longer than their purposes required. They built their fortress cities behind the shield wall in the sheltered north, and chief among them was the city of Arrakeen, a place of high stone walls and narrow shaded streets, of great sealed houses that hoarded their moisture behind thick doors. They walked those streets in suits designed to trap the body's own water and give it back, and they measured their days by the harvest they had come to reap. To them, the deep desert was only a danger and a nuisance, a wilderness to be crossed as quickly as possible, a place fit only for the harvesting machines and for the wild folk who somehow lived out there beyond the reach of law. For there were people who called this desert home, people who had made their peace with its harshness and had turned even its cruelty to their advantage. But that is a story for a later hour. Tonight, it is enough to hold in the mind the shape of the world itself, this dry and shining planet turning slowly under its white sun and its two watching moons. This ocean of sand, where water was the dearest of all things, and where a single buried secret waited beneath the dunes. Let us rest here for a moment in that great silence, in the cool blue hush of the desert night, before we go on to learn what it was that lay hidden in the sand. Up next in Chapter 6, The Spice Melange and the Sandworms, we will go down into the deep desert to discover the treasure that made Arrakis the center of the universe, and to meet the vast and ancient creatures that guarded it. Tonight, we return to the sands of Arrakis to learn the nature of its buried secret, the thing for which emperors schemed and great houses spent their fortunes and their blood. It was not gold, and it was not any jewel dug from the deep rock. It was a fine reddish-brown powder, faintly aglow, that carried on the air a scent some likened to cinnamon, and others could never quite name. The people of the universe called it Melange, though most spoke of it simply as the spice. And the spice was found on Arrakis alone. In all the vastness of the known worlds, nowhere else at all. The spice was a wonder, unlike anything else that human hands had ever gathered. Taken in small amounts, it stirred the body toward long life, holding back the years and keeping the aged strong and clear far beyond their natural span. Those who lived steeped in it could reach ages that would have seemed impossible on other worlds. But the spice did more than lengthen life. It sharpened the mind and widened the doors of awareness, lifting the veil that lay across ordinary sight until a person seemed to sense more, to know more, to touch the very edges of time itself. In great and dangerous quantities, it could even open a mind to glimpses of what was yet to come. It was medicine and luxury, sacrament and drug, all folded together in one glowing powder. And no other substance in all the known worlds could do what it did or take its place. Because of this, the spice threaded itself into every corner of civilization. The rich seasoned their food with it and grew accustomed to its taste until they could not do without it. For the spice held those who used it in a long and quiet grip. To take melange for years and then to lose it was to sicken and, in the end, to die. Once a body had learned to live upon the spice became as needful as water or as breath, and so the demand for it never faltered. It flowed outward from Arrakis to 10,000 worlds, and the wealth that flowed back was beyond counting. Yet the deepest importance of the spice lay in something stranger still, for melange was the secret heart of all travel between the stars. In an age when thinking machines had long been forbidden, no computer could be built to guide a ship safely across the terrible gulfs of folded space. That task fell instead to the navigators of the Spacing Guild, and it was the spice, taken in enormous and constant amounts, that gave them the prescient vision they needed. Steeped in melange until their very bodies were changed by it, the navigators could see the countless paths a great ship might take through folded space, and choose the one safe course among them, so that the vessel arrived whole instead of shattering upon some unseen ruin. Without the spice, there could be no safe folding of space. Without the folding of space, the 10,000 worlds would drift apart into silence, each one marooned and alone. And so the whole of the Imperium, all its trade and all its power, rested in the end upon a powder gathered from the sands of one dry planet. This gave rise to the oldest and truest saying of that age, a thought repeated in council chambers and quiet rooms across the universe. Whoever controlled the spice controlled the universe itself. To hold Arrakis was to hold the throat of civilization, and every power that mattered knew it, and every power that mattered watched the sands of Dune with hungry and careful eyes. But the spice did not offer itself up gently, and here we come to the great mystery that lay beneath the dunes. For the melange was not merely a mineral to be scraped from the rock. It was bound, in ways the off-worlders barely understood, to the deep life of the desert, and above all to the creatures that ruled the open sand. The people of Arrakis called them by an old and reverent name. They called them the Makers, and also Shai Hulud, the great-grandfather of the desert, the old man of the sand. To the rest of the universe they were known more plainly as the Sandworms. The Sandworms were living things of a scale that beggared belief. The greatest of them grew to lengths of 400 meters and more, vast segmented beasts that moved beneath the dunes like whales beneath a sea, parting the sand before them and closing it behind. When one rose to the surface, it opened a round mouth ringed with rows upon rows of crystalline teeth, a mouth wide enough to swallow a harvesting machine whole. They had no eyes, for in the lightless deep of the sand they had no need of them. Instead, they felt the world through movement and through sound, and any steady rhythmic beat upon the surface would call them from far away. drawn by the promise of prey or of intrusion in their domain. For this reason, those who walked the open desert learned to move without rhythm, to break their steps into an uneven shuffle so that the sand itself would not betray them to the waiting maker below. These great worms were fiercely territorial, and they suffered nothing to move across their sands without answer. When the harvesting crews came out to gather the spice, they worked always under the shadow of that danger. For a worm would come to any large working upon the dunes, come swift and certain out of the deep, and there was no fighting it and no stopping it. It could rise beneath a crawler and drag the whole machine down into the sand, crew and cargo and all, in a matter of moments. And so spice mining on Arrakis was a race against the desert itself, a constant watching of the horizon for the great swell and ripple that meant a maker was on its way, followed by a desperate rush to lift the harvester clear before the sand opened and swallowed everything. And here lay the deep and hidden truth of Arrakis, the thing that tied the whole of it together into one great living cycle. The sandworms and the spice were bound to one another in a bond older than any human record. The worms were not the enemies of the melange, but its guardians, and, in their strange way, its makers, for the spice was born of the deep desert life over which the worms held dominion. Where the worms lived, the spice was found. Where the worms were driven away, the spice failed. The desert people understood this, though the off-worlders in their fortress cities largely did not, or did not care to. The greedy came, and they scraped their fortunes from the sand, and they thought of the worms only as a hazard to be outrun. They did not see, or would not see, that the treasure and the terror were one and the same, that the very creatures they feared were the source of all the wealth they craved. So the great cycle turned on, endless and indifferent to the schemes of men. The worms swam the deep desert as they had for uncounted ages. The spice glowed faintly in the sand. The harvesters came and fled and came again, and far away on 1,000 gentler worlds, the powerful savored their melange, and the navigators folded space, and the wealth flowed on. All of it, the whole vast machinery of empire, rested upon the sand of Arrakis and upon the great old worms that swam beneath it, drawn by the beat of movement, guarding a treasure they neither understood nor knew they kept. Let us hold that thought gently as the desert settles into night, the great makers gliding unseen below the cooling dunes, the spice waiting patiently in the dark for hands bold enough or desperate enough to come and gather it. Up next in Chapter 7, the Fremen of the Deep Desert, we will meet the hardy people who made this merciless wilderness their home, who learned its every secret, and who carried in their hearts an old and patient prophecy. Tonight, we go out past the fortress walls and the sheltered cities of the north, out beyond the reach of the off-world lords, into the open sand where they believed no ordinary person could ever live. For the powerful who came to Arrakis to reap its spice thought of the deep desert as an empty and deadly waste, fit only for their machines and for the storms. But they were wrong, gently and completely wrong. The desert was not empty. It was home to a people, an old and hardy people, who had made their peace with the sand across many long generations. They were called the Fremen, and they were the true children of Dune. No one knew for certain how long the Fremen had dwelt upon Arrakis. Their own memory reached back across countless years to a long wandering that had brought their ancestors at last to this harsh planet. And there, in the crucible of the desert, they had been shaped into something new. Where the off-worlders saw only a place to endure and to flee, the Fremen saw a home. They did not merely survive the desert. They had learned to belong to it so wholly that they moved through it as easily as a fish moves through water, reading its moods, keeping its secrets, loving it with a fierce and quiet devotion that the soft folk of gentler worlds could scarcely imagine. The first law of life on Arrakis was water, and the Fremen had bent their whole existence around it. On a world where a single mouthful was precious beyond measure, they wasted nothing, not one drop, not ever. To this end they wore a marvel of their own careful craft, a close garment called the still suit. The still suit covered the whole body, and it worked by capturing every trace of moisture the body gave off, the sweat of the skin, the breath of the lungs, even the water of the body's other wastes. All of it was gathered and filtered and cleaned within the suit, and returned to the wearer to drink again through a small tube at the neck. A well-made still suit, worn well, would lose its wearer no more than a thimbleful of moisture in a whole day of walking under the sun. In this way, the Fremen carried their own small world of water with them wherever they went, and the desert that killed strangers in hours could not so easily kill them. But they did not rely on their suits alone. Across the long ages, the Fremen had gathered water in secret, a little at a time, saving it against a dream that few outside their number even suspected, and they gathered it above all in the way they treated their own dead. When a Fremen died, the water of the body was not lost. It was carefully reclaimed and given back to the tribe, held in trust as a sacred inheritance. For among the Fremen, the water of a person belonged in the end to the people. Great hidden basins lay concealed beneath the rock, vast stores of water tended in darkness, saved patiently across generation after generation toward a distant and cherished hope, the dream that one day, far in the future, the desert itself might be coaxed to bloom and Arrakis be made green and living. It was a dream so long and so patient that no single Fremen who labored for it ever expected to see it come to pass. The Fremen did not live scattered and alone, but gathered together in hidden communities, and these they called sietches. A sietch was a warren of chambers and passages carved into the rock of the desert, sealed away from the killing heat and hidden from any eyes that might come searching from the sky. Within those cool stone halls, whole communities lived out their lives, keeping their water stores, raising their children, and guarding the ways of their people. The sietches were scattered across the deep desert and among the rocklands, and their locations were among the most closely held of all Fremen secrets. For the off-world rulers, had they known how many Fremen there truly were, and where they truly dwelt, would have feared them greatly. And in this, the rulers were fools, for they badly underestimated the numbers and the strength of the desert people, seeing only a scattering of ragged wanderers, where in truth a whole nation lay hidden in the sand. Life in the sietch was hard, and it bred a people hard to match. The Fremen were the finest desert fighters in all the universe, swift and silent and utterly without fear of death. For the desert had long since taught them to hold their own lives lightly. They fought with the crysknife, a blade shaped from the crystalline tooth of a sandworm, a weapon so sacred to them that it was said a crysknife, once drawn, should not be sheathed again until it had tasted blood. They were fierce in defense of their own and merciless to those who threatened them. Yet among themselves they were bound by deep loyalty and by an unbending code of honor. They shared their water and their shelter. They cared for the families of the fallen, and they held their given word as a thing more solid than the rock around them. Above all, they prized their freedom. They bowed to no off-world lord in their hearts, however they might seem to bend, and they answered in the end only to their own leaders and their own ancient ways. They had even learned to master the great terror of the sand, for the Fremen alone, of all the peoples of Arrakis, had found the way to call and to ride the mighty sandworms. Using tools of their own devising, they could summon a maker from the deep, mount its vast back as it rose through the dunes, and ride it swiftly across the desert that stopped every other traveler. To the off-worlders, this seemed an impossible and terrifying thing, a feat close to sorcery. To the Fremen, it was simply one more part of the deep knowledge that made the desert their own. The worms they treated not only as beasts of burden, but as something close to holy, the great Shai Hulud, woven into the very center of their faith. For the Fremen carried within them not only skills and secrets, but a deep and patient faith. And within that faith there lay a prophecy. It was said among them, from the elders to the children, that a day would come when a leader would arise, a voice from the outer world, one born of another place, who would nonetheless become their own and lead them at last to freedom and to their green paradise. They called this awaited one by names of power and longing. He would be the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world. He would be the Mahdi, the one who would lead them to true deliverance. Down all the generations, the Fremen had kept this hope alive, tending it as carefully as they tended their hidden water, waiting for a sign, waiting for the one who would come from beyond the sand and fulfill the words their grandfathers had passed to them. What few among them knew was how that prophecy had first come to be planted in their hearts, or what strange forces from far away had a hand in shaping it long ago. Nor could they yet guess how near the day of its testing had drawn. But the waiting was patient, and the desert was patient, and the Fremen held their hope quietly beneath the sand as they had held it for so long. Let us leave them there for now, safe in their hidden sietches as the cold desert night comes down, water stored in the darkness, the old prophecy warm in every heart, the great worms swimming far below. Up next in Chapter 8, House Atreides of Caladan, we will travel across the stars to a green and rain-washed world, far from the dry sands of Dune, to meet the noble family whose fate was soon to become bound forever to the desert planet. Tonight we leave the dry sands of Arrakis far behind and journey across the great gulf of stars to a world as different from Dune as any world could be. Its name was Caladan, and it was a place of water and of green. Where Arrakis was all sun and thirst, Caladan was a planet of oceans and of gentle rain, of gray seas rolling under gray skies, of wet fields and river deltas, of fishing villages tucked along its shores. It was a soft and living world, and it had been the home of House Atreides for 26 generations. Let us settle there for a while, among the sound of rain and the smell of the sea, and come to know the family whose story we are following. House Atreides was one of the great houses of the Landsraad, an ancient and noble line whose roots ran back across the long history of the Imperium. It was not the richest of the houses, nor the largest, nor did it command the greatest armies, but it held something that in the end proved rarer and more dangerous than any of those things. House Atreides was beloved. Across many worlds its name was spoken with respect and with genuine affection, for the Atreides ruled by loyalty rather than by fear, and men followed them not because they were forced to, but because they wished to. This was the quiet strength of the house, and it was also, though few yet saw it, the source of the peril that would one day fall upon them. At the head of the family stood Duke Leto Atreides, and he was in many ways the very picture of what a noble lord should be. He was just and he was honorable, careful of his people and generous with his trust. He understood that true loyalty could not be bought or beaten out of men, but had to be earned, and he earned it again and again through fairness and through courage. His soldiers would have followed him anywhere. His people loved him. Even his rivals, in their private hearts, respected him. Duke Leto carried the weight of his house with a grave and steady dignity, and he governed Caladan with a wisdom that had made it prosperous and content. Yet, he was not blind to the dangers of the world he lived in, and he knew well that a house admired is a house watched, and that admiration among the powerful can curdle quietly into envy. At the Duke's side, though never as his wife, stood the Lady Jessica. She was his concubine, the mother of his only son, and the love of his life, though the customs of the great houses had never allowed them to marry. For a duke's hand in marriage was a piece on the board of imperial politics, to be kept free for alliances not yet made. Jessica was beautiful and graceful, but far more than that, she was a woman of extraordinary training and hidden power. For she was of the Bene Gesserit, that ancient sisterhood of women schooled across a lifetime in the deepest disciplines of body and mind. She could read the smallest movements of a face and know the truth beneath a spoken word. She commanded her own body down to the beat of her heart. She could, when she chose, put a strange, compelling power into her voice that few could resist. These gifts she used quietly, in the shadows, in service of her duke and her family, and they made her a far greater force than any in that household, save perhaps her son, would ever fully understand. That son was Paul, the child of Leto and Jessica, and he was the heir to House Atreides. Paul was still young, a boy on the edge of becoming a man, but there was already something uncommon about him, a gravity and a watchfulness beyond his years. He had been raised as befitted the heir of a great house, tutored in history and in statecraft, in the arts of leadership and the ways of the Imperium, but he had been given, in secret, a stranger's schooling as well, for his mother had taught him something of the hidden Bene Gesserit ways, against the rules of her own sisterhood. And so, Paul grew up shaped by two worlds at once, the open world of a young lord in training and the quiet inward world of disciplines few men were ever permitted to learn. He did not yet know what he was, or what he might become. But the seeds of it were already in him, waiting. Around this small family gathered a circle of loyal and gifted men, the trusted household of House Atreides, and among them were some of the most remarkable figures of the age. There was Gurney Halleck, a scarred and battle-hardened warrior with the soul of a poet, who could break a man in combat and then sit down to play sweet music upon a 9-stringed baliset. Fierce in war and tender in friendship, Gurney served the house with a fervent devotion, and he became one of Paul's teachers in the arts of the blade, forever pushing the boy to sharpen himself against real danger. There was Duncan Idaho, a swordmaster without equal, bold and warm and utterly fearless, whom Paul loved almost as an older brother, and who returned that love without reserve. There was Thufir Hawat, the aged Mentat, a human mind trained across a lifetime to calculate and to reason with a precision that in an older age would have been given to machines, who served the house as its master of assassins and its keeper of strategy. And there was Dr. Wellington Yue, the house physician, a gentle and learned man bound to the Atreides by the highest conditioning of his order, a man whom no one in the household ever thought to doubt. Together these men and this family formed something rare in the Imperium, a house held together not by chains of fear, but by ties of genuine love and loyalty. Duncan and Gurney would have died for Duke Leto gladly. Thufir gave his whole vast mind to the service of the house, and at the center of it all, Leto and Jessica raised their son with care, hoping to hand him one day a proud and living inheritance. There was warmth in the halls of Caladan, and laughter, and the deep security of a family that trusted one another. It was, for a time, a good life, lived under gray skies beside a rolling sea. Yet that very goodness was becoming a shadow over them, though they did not yet know how dark. For in the wider Imperium, in the high seats of power far from the quiet shores of Caladan, the rising fame of House Atreides had begun to trouble certain jealous hearts. A house so admired, so capable, so beloved of its people and its peers, was a house that others might one day rally around. And there were those on the imperial throne and in rival houses who watched the Atreides with narrowing eyes and turned over in their minds how such a house might be brought low before it grew too strong. The very love that made House Atreides great was drawing toward it a danger it could not yet see. But that reckoning had not yet come. For now, the rain still fell on Caladan, and the sea still rolled against its shores, and Duke Leto still walked the halls of his ancestors with his lady beside him and his son growing tall. Let us leave them there, in that last untroubled peace, in the green and water-blessed world that had been their home for 26 generations, safe and warm and together for one more quiet night before the deep currents of the wider universe come at last to carry them far away. Up next in Chapter 9, The Emperor's Poisoned Gift, we will follow those currents to the imperial throne itself, where a jealous emperor lays a hidden trap, and learn how the fate of House Atreides became bound forever to the desert sands of Arrakis. In the vast and quiet machinery of the Imperium, power moved slowly, like sand settling after a storm, and at its very center sat the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, ruler of 1,000,000 worlds. For decades he had held the great balance of the empire in his hands, weighing house against house, tempering the ambitions of the Landsraad, keeping the noble families circling one another like distant moons. He was a man who had grown used to being feared and used to being obeyed, and in the long comfort of his reign, he had come to believe that no shadow could ever grow tall enough to fall across his throne. Yet even the most secure of thrones is watched over by quiet worries, and in the emperor's heart, hidden beneath his golden robes and his ancient titles, there had begun to grow a small and gnawing unease. The cause of that unease was House Atreides, and above all the man who led it, Duke Leto, whom the people called Leto the Just. Across the Imperium, the name of the Atreides was spoken with warmth, and warmth was a rare and dangerous currency among the great houses. Leto did not rule through terror, as so many did, nor did he purchase loyalty with fear. Instead, he earned it, patiently and honestly, so that the men who served him would have followed him into any darkness. His soldiers loved him. His people trusted him. Other dukes and barons and counts of the Landsraad watched Caladan and saw in Leto something they did not possess, a natural authority that could not be bought or forged, only given freely by those who chose to give it. And a leader who is loved is a leader who may one day be followed, and a leader who may be followed is, in the cold reckoning of empire, a rival in waiting, whether or not he ever dreams of raising his hand against the throne. To the emperor, this was not a virtue to be admired, but a threat to be measured. He understood, as all rulers eventually understand, that popularity among equals is a kind of quiet power, and that quiet power has a way of growing while no one is looking. He had heard the whispers from his own court, murmurs that the Landsraad might one day look to Duke Leto for leadership, that the loyalty Leto inspired might gather other houses around him like water gathering into a single stream. There were even whispers, softer still, about the fighting men of Caladan, disciplined and devoted, trained to a standard that some said rivaled the Emperor's own dreaded Sardaukar. That last thought, more than any other, kept sleep at a distance from Shaddam IV. For the Sardaukar were the true secret of Corino power. They were soldiers raised on the harsh prison planet of Seleucia Secundus, forged in a world of cruelty and hardship until only the strongest remained. They fought with a ferocity that no ordinary army could match, and it was upon their terrible strength that the whole balance of the Imperium truly rested. The great houses obeyed the emperor not merely from tradition, but because they knew what waited for any house that dared to defy him. And so, the mere possibility that another family might quietly be building soldiers of comparable quality was, to Shaddam, a wound that could not be left to fester. Yet the Emperor could not simply strike at House Atreides in the open. To do so would be to shatter the very order he was sworn to protect. The great houses of the Landsraad were bound together by ancient law and ancient custom, and if the Emperor were seen to destroy a beloved and honorable house without cause, the other families would understand at last that none of them was safe. Their fear of him might curdle into something more dangerous, a shared and desperate resolve, and 100 houses acting together could unseat even a Corrino. So the blow, if it were to fall, had to fall in shadow. It had to wear the mask of a gift. And here, the Emperor found his instrument in the oldest and bitterest of enemies, the Harkonnens. For generations, House Harkonnen and House Atreides had hated one another with a hatred that ran deeper than politics. A feud born of an ancient betrayal and nursed across the long centuries until it had become a part of who they were. The Harkonnens were everything the Atreides were not, cruel where Leto was kind, grasping where he was generous, ruled by the vast and monstrous Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, a man whose appetite for power and cruelty seemed to know no bottom. For 80 years the Harkonnens had held the desert planet of Arrakis, and from its endless sands they had drawn a wealth beyond imagining. For Arrakis, the world men called Dune, was the only source in all the universe of the spice melange, the most precious substance that existed. Whoever governed Arrakis controlled the flow of spice, and whoever controlled the spice held the fate of the known worlds in the palm of a hand. The Harkonnens had grown rich beyond counting on that trade, and rich beyond counting on cruelty, squeezing the planet and its people for every drop of profit. Their wealth was the wealth of Arrakis, and their power flowed from it as surely as the spice flowed to the stars. And so the Emperor devised his trap, and it was a thing of terrible cleverness, for it turned generosity itself into a weapon. He would command Duke Leto to leave the ocean world of Caladan, the green and gentle home his family had held for 26 generations, and to take up the governorship of Arrakis. He would strip the fief from the Harkonnens and grant it to the Atreides. And to the watching houses of the Landsraad it would appear a great honor, a mark of the Emperor's high favor. In truth, it was a snare, and every part of it had been shaped to close upon its victim. For the Emperor understood what Leto could only suspect. To refuse the command was impossible, for an imperial order carried the full weight of the throne, and to defy it was to invite open ruin. Yet to accept it was to walk willingly into a place already poisoned against him. Arrakis was a Harkonnen world in all but name, riddled with their hidden loyalties, their sabotaged machinery, their agents planted in every corner. The Duke would arrive as a stranger in a hostile land, cut off from the safety of Caladan, surrounded by enemies who knew every dune and every secret, while he knew none. He would be exposed, isolated, and vulnerable, exactly as the Emperor wished him to be. And behind the mask of the gift, a darker arrangement had been made. In secret, Shaddam had come to an understanding with the Baron, an understanding so dangerous that neither could ever speak of it openly. The Harkonnens would strike, and when they did, the Emperor would lend them a measure of his own invincible Sardaukar, disguised in Harkonnen colors, so that no eye could trace the crime back to the throne. Between them, they would fall upon House Atreides and destroy it utterly, and the world would be told only that a noble house had failed to hold a difficult planet. The Emperor would keep his hands clean, the Baron would reclaim his prize, and the one house that Shaddam had come to fear would simply vanish from the pages of history. It was jealousy that lay at the root of it all, a small and human failing grown monstrous in the heart of the most powerful man alive. He did not hate Leto. In some quiet corner, he may even have respected him. But respect in the cold arithmetic of empire was itself a reason for fear, and fear was reason enough to kill. The trap was set, patient and silent, waiting only for the Duke to walk into it, believing all the while that he had been honored. Up next in Chapter 10, the Handover of Arrakis, we will follow House Atreides as it leaves the green shores of Caladan behind and takes up its perilous new rule beneath the burning desert sun. And so the great departure began, and it was a solemn thing, for a house does not lightly leave the world that made it. For 26 generations, House Atreides had ruled Caladan, a world of gray seas and endless rain, of fishing boats and green hills and skies heavy with cloud. It was a gentle planet, rich in water, that most precious of all things, and its people had never known thirst. To leave it was to leave a part of themselves behind, and though the Duke wore the calm face of command, those closest to him understood the weight he carried. He knew, or at least he suspected, that the honor he had been granted was something far more dangerous than an honor. Yet an imperial command could not be refused, and a duke does not flee from his duty. The great ships of the Spacing Guild carried them across the Gulf of Stars, from the soft gray of Caladan to the harsh gold of Arrakis, and when they descended at last upon the desert world, it was as if they had passed from one kind of life into another. Where Caladan had been water, Arrakis was sand, an ocean of it, stretching from horizon to horizon beneath a sun that burned without mercy. There was no rain here, no rivers, no gentle green. Water was so rare that it was hoarded like treasure, and a single tear was thought a gift too precious to give. The very air pulled the moisture from the body, and to walk unprotected in the open desert was to invite a slow and certain death. The Atreides made their home in Arrakeen, the fortress city that served as the seat of power on Dune. It was a place of high walls and thick stone, built to keep out both the heat and the enemy, and the Harkonnens had left it behind them like a discarded shell. The Duke understood at once that the city was riddled with dangers, that traps and hidden agents might lie behind any door, and he set his most loyal men to the task of securing it. There was Thufir Hawat, the aged Mentat and master of assassins, whose trained mind worked through webs of treachery like a spider reading its own threads. There was Gurney Halleck, the scarred warrior poet, fierce in battle and gentle with the instrument in his hands. And there was Duncan Idaho, the swordmaster, sent ahead to make contact with the desert people and returning full of wonder at what he had found. For the true wealth of Arrakis lay not within the walls of Arrakeen, but out upon the open sand, where the spice was gathered. The harvesting of Melange was a labor of constant peril, for the spice lay in the deep desert, and the deep desert belonged to the Sandworms. These were the great beasts of Dune, creatures of impossible size that swam beneath the sand as whales swim beneath the sea, drawn by any steady rhythm upon the surface. When the enormous harvesting machines crawled out to gather the spice, they were always racing against time, for the worms would come, always they would come, rising from the depths to swallow machine and men alike, unless the crawler could be lifted away in time. The Duke went out himself to see the harvest, taking his son with him, for he believed a ruler should understand with his own eyes the source of his power and his peril. And so, it was that the boy Paul first looked upon the deep desert in all its terrible beauty. He watched the spice crawler at its work, watched the tension of the men who knew what stalked beneath them, and then he saw the thing itself. The sign of a worm appeared upon the sand, a swelling ripple racing toward the machine, and in the desperate scramble that followed a carrier, failed to arrive in time. The Duke, seeing men stranded and doomed, gave the order to save the workers, rather than the priceless machine, and in that single choice he revealed to the desert the measure of the man he was. He valued human life above spice, and there were eyes upon the sand that noted it well. For Paul, that day upon the desert changed something deep within him. He had already begun to feel the strange stirrings of the spice, which hung in the very air of Arrakis, in every breath and every mouthful of food. It sharpened his awareness in ways he could not name, and it stirred within him faint and troubling glimpses of things not yet come to pass. He was a boy who had been trained since childhood in the ways of the Mentat and the disciplines of the Bene Gesserit, taught by his mother the secret arts of that ancient sisterhood, and now the desert world was awakening in him something that no teacher had planted. He did not yet understand it. He only knew that Arrakis was calling to him, and that he could not turn away. His mother understood more than he did, and what she understood filled her with a quiet and growing wonder. The Lady Jessica was of the Bene Gesserit, bound by their disciplines and their long secret purposes, and she knew the ways in which her sisterhood worked in the shadows of history. For centuries, the Bene Gesserit had walked among the peoples of the outer worlds, and wherever they went they had planted seeds, prophecies and legends carefully sown, so that a sister in need might one day find shelter in belief. The Missionaria Protectiva. They called this quiet work, the sowing of superstition as a tool of survival. And upon Arrakis, among the desert people, such seeds had long ago been planted. For the Fremen, the native people of the deep desert, carried among them an old and patient prophecy. They spoke of a voice from the outer world, a mother and a son who would come to them from beyond the sand, and of a Messiah who would lead them at last to freedom and to paradise. When Jessica heard the reverence with which the Fremen looked upon her, and above all upon her son, she recognized the shape of her sisterhood's ancient handiwork. She saw the prophecy settling around Paul like a mantle he had not asked to wear, and she felt within her the first cold touch of understanding. That whether by design or by something greater than design, her boy stood at the center of a story far older and far larger than House Atreides. There was a Fremen woman in the service of Arrakeen, a Shadout-Mapes, keeper of the household, who tested the Lady Jessica and found in her the marks of the prophecy, and who gave into her keeping a weapon of the deepest desert, a blade shaped from the tooth of a sandworm, a crysknife, sacred beyond words to those who carried it. And there was the planetary ecologist, a man named Liet Kynes, servant of the Emperor, in name yet something else entirely in his heart, who watched the new Duke and his family with careful eyes, and slowly, almost against his will, began to hope. For a brief and fragile season, it seemed that House Atreides might yet take root in that harsh soil. The Duke reached toward the Fremen, seeking not to rule them by fear, but to win them as allies, understanding that in those hardened desert survivors lay a strength no other house had ever thought to grasp. He dreamed of a new kind of power, born not of spice alone, but of the loyalty of a people the Harkonnens had only ever despised. It was a noble dream, and had it been given time, it might have changed the fate of the Empire. But time was the one thing House Atreides did not have, for the trap had already closed around them, and the night of betrayal was very near. Up next in Chapter 11, the betrayal and the fall of House Atreides, we will tell, softly and with sorrow, of the terrible night when the trap was sprung and a noble house was brought to ruin. The blow, when it came in the darkness, as such blows so often do. For weeks the Duke and his men had felt the closing of the net, had known that somewhere among them treachery was at work, and yet they could not name it, could not see the hand that moved against them. Thufir Hawat, the old Mentat, turned his suspicions over and over, searching for the traitor, and his careful mind fell upon the Lady Jessica herself, for that was precisely where the enemy wished it to fall. The true betrayer wore another face entirely, a face trusted and close, and the misdirection was as cruel as the plot itself. And so the House of Atreides watched the wrong shadow, while the real danger drew silently near. The traitor was Dr. Wellington Yue, the Suk physician, a man conditioned by the deepest arts of his order, so that it should have been impossible for him ever to bring harm to those in his care. The Harkonnens had found the one lever that could break even such conditioning. They had taken his wife, Wana, whom he loved beyond all reason, and they held her, and they promised him that if he served them, she would be freed from her suffering. It was a lie, as such promises always are. But a drowning man will grasp at any hand, and Yue, tormented beyond endurance, agreed to open the door to ruin. He did not do it for greed or for hatred. He did it for love, twisted into a weapon, and the sorrow of it lay heavy upon him even as he moved to betray the family that had trusted him. On the appointed night, Yue did his terrible work. He lowered the great shield that protected Arrakeen, the invisible wall that turned aside all attack, and with that single act, he laid the fortress open. He drugged the Duke, so that Leto fell helpless and could not raise a hand in his own defense. And then, out of the darkness, the enemy poured in. The Harkonnen legions came with all their cruelty, and with them came soldiers who wore Harkonnen colors, but fought with a discipline and a ferocity no ordinary troops could match. These were the Sardaukar, the Emperor's own dreaded warriors, sent in secret to make certain that the Atreides would not survive the night. The gift had become the grave, exactly as Shaddam had intended. The battle, if it can be called a battle, was swift and merciless. The defenders of Arrakeen, brave and loyal to the last, were overwhelmed by numbers and by treachery combined. Men who had followed Duke Leto across the stars, who had loved him and trusted in his justice, fell in the corridors and courtyards of the fortress they had barely begun to call home. There was no great and glorious stand, no turning of the tide. There was only the slow and sorrowful extinguishing of a light that had shone so brightly, house by house and hall by hall, until the fortress that had been Atreides belonged to their enemies once more. Yet Yue, even in his treason, was not wholly without mercy, and the last threads of his broken conscience shaped the little good that remained. He knew that the Duke was doomed, that nothing could be done to save him, but he could not bring himself to let the Baron have everything. And so, before the end, he crept to the drugged and helpless Leto, and placed within his mouth a hidden weapon, a false tooth filled with a killing gas. It was a desperate gift offered to a dying man, a single chance to strike one final blow against the monster who had ordered it all. And Yue whispered to the fallen Duke the truth of what had been done, and asked, in his own grief, for a measure of understanding that he surely did not deserve. The Duke was carried before the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, who had come to gloat over the ruin of his ancient enemy. The vast and floating form of the Baron looked down upon the man he had at last destroyed, savoring the triumph of a feud 80 years and more in the making. And in that moment, Leto Atreides gathered the last of his failing strength and bit down upon the tooth that Yue had given him, releasing the poison in a final breath. The Duke died in that instant, and the killing gas spread out around him, and though the Baron by fortune escaped the worst of it, others near him did not. Leto the Just perished, but he perished reaching for his enemy, and there was in that a bitter dignity that even death could not take from him. He had given his life, in the end, as he had lived it, for those he loved and against the cruelty he despised. For for the Baron had no intention of leaving any Atreides alive. The Duke was dead, and now the last of the bloodline had to be erased, the woman Jessica, and above all the boy Paul, the son and heir in whom the future of the house still faintly flickered. To dispose of them, the Baron did not even trouble himself with ceremony. He handed the task to cruel and careless hands, ordering that the mother and child be carried out into the deep desert and left there, bound to die of thirst and heat and the mercy of the sand. It was, to the Baron, a fitting end and a tidy one. No blood upon his own halls, no bodies to be found, only 2 more travelers swallowed by the endless dunes of Arrakis. He believed the matter finished. He believed House Atreides at last extinct. But the desert keeps its own counsel, and the plans of cruel men do not always run as they intend. Jessica was Bene Gesserit, and though bound and guarded, she was far from helpless. Among the disciplines of her sisterhood was the voice, a way of shaping command through the very tones of speech so that the untrained could not resist it. And Paul, young as he was, had been trained in that same power and in far more besides. In the darkness of the flyer that bore them to their deaths, mother and son found their chance, and by wit and by the voice they turned their captor's own weakness against them and won their freedom in the very jaws of doom. And there was help they did not know of, laid ready by a dead man's last regret. Yua, before the end, had arranged for a package to be hidden in the desert where they might find it, and within it were the tools of survival, and the ducal signet ring of House Atreides, and a stilton and a message. He had betrayed them to their ruin, and yet he had also, in his sorrow, given them the slenderest thread of a chance. It was not forgiveness he had earned, and Paul would carry the knowledge of his treachery forever. But without that last small mercy, the story of House Atreides would have ended there upon the sand, and no more would ever have been told of it. So it was that on the night House Atreides fell, its duke lay dead, and its fortress lost, and its loyal men scattered or slain, and the Baron Harkonnen believed himself wholly victorious. Yet out in the vast and moonlit desert, beyond the reach of his knowledge, 2 figures walked alone into the dunes, a mother and her son, the last of a noble line, carrying with them nothing but their lives and a handful of tools and a grief too deep for words. The great house had fallen, softly and terribly, into the dark. But it had not been utterly extinguished, and the desert that was meant to be their grave would become, instead, the cradle of everything that was to come. Up next in Chapter 12, Paul and Jessica in the desert, we will follow the mother and son into the deep sand, and into the visions that begin to open before them like a fearful and shining road. And so the mother and son walked out into the deep desert, alone, beneath a sky thick with stars, and behind them the fires of Arrakeen glowed faint and terrible upon the horizon. All that they had known was gone. The Duke was dead, the house was fallen, and the loyal men who might have protected them were scattered or slain. There remained only the 2 of them, Jessica and Paul, and the small bundle of tools that a dead man's last regret had hidden for them among the rocks. They were the last of House Atreides, and the desert that stretched before them had been chosen as their grave. Yet they were not ready to lie down and die, and so they walked, step by patient step, into the vast and silent night. The first task of survival on Arrakis was water, and the tools left to them included the means of preserving it. There was a stilton, a shelter that could reclaim the moisture of their own breath and their own bodies, sealing them away from the pitiless thirst of the open air. There were stillsuits as well, those marvels of Fremen craft that captured every drop a body lost, from sweat and breath and waste, and returned it purified for drinking. Jessica, wise in many things, was yet a stranger to the desert, and it was often Paul who seemed to know, as if by instinct, how such things should be worn and used. The spice was in him now, deep in his blood and in his mind, and it was awakening knowledge he had never been taught. They fled first toward the shelter of the rock, for the open sand was the realm of the worms, and to walk upon it was to summon death. For the great sandworms of Dune were drawn to rhythm, to any steady and regular beating upon the surface of the desert. A marching stride, the tread of machinery, the pulse of a dropped device, all of these called the worms up from the deep, and when they came, they swallowed whatever had disturbed their domain. So Paul learned, and taught himself in the learning, to walk without rhythm, to break his stride into an irregular and shuffling gait that the sand would not betray, a walk that mimicked the natural shifting of the dunes themselves. It was the walk of the Fremen, though he did not yet know them, and the desert itself was teaching him their ways. There came a night when the worm found them all the same, drawn not by their steps, but by machinery abandoned upon the sand, and mother and son crouched together as the ground itself seemed to rise and roar. The sight of it filled them with a terror that was almost reverence, for the sandworm was a thing beyond the scale of ordinary life, a living force of the planet, ancient and vast and utterly without mercy. They survived it by stillness and by wit, by understanding that the worm sought the throbbing rhythm and not the two small hearts crouched motionless upon the rock. And in surviving, Paul felt the shape of the desert settling into him, the harsh logic of a world where every breath and every footfall might mean the difference between living and dying. But it was not the worms, nor the thirst, nor the enemies at their backs that most frightened Paul in those long desert nights. It was what was happening within his own mind. The spice, breathed and swallowed in everything upon Arrakis, and now, concentrated in the very air of the deep desert, was opening in him a door that could not be closed again. He began to see, not with his eyes, but with something older and deeper, a terrible awareness that reached forward through the branching pathways of time. He saw futures, many of them spread before him like the countless grains of the sand itself, and in nearly all of them he saw the same thing, a green and terrible banner, legions of desert warriors carrying his name across the stars, and blood, oceans of blood, spilled in that name upon 100 worlds. This was the burden that had been prepared for him across centuries, though he did not yet fully grasp it. He was the child of the Bene Gesserit breeding program, though born a generation too soon and in defiance of their careful plans. For his mother Jessica had been commanded to bear only daughters and had instead, out of love for her duke, born a son. In Paul something long sought had awakened, a mind that could reach into the deep memory of both the male and the female past and forward into the shimmering uncertainty of what was to come. He was becoming the one the sisterhood had labored to create, and he had not asked for it, and the visions of the future terrified him even as they revealed themselves. For Paul understood, young as he was, that a man who can see the future is not made free by it, but bound. The pathways stretched before him, and he could see how one choice led to another, how the smallest act might swell into a flood that no hand could turn aside. He saw the holy war that waited at the end of so many roads, the jihad that would be waged in his name whether he willed it or not, and he searched among the branching futures for a path that might avoid it, and struggled to find one. The knowledge sat upon him like a great weight, and it aged something within him far beyond his years, so that the boy who had left Caladan was already out there upon the sand, becoming something else. Jessica watched the change in her son with a mother's fear and a Bene Gesserit's understanding. She saw him withdraw into silences she could not enter, saw his eyes turn inward toward sights she could not share, and she knew that the spice was working in him a transformation beyond anything her sisterhood had foreseen. He had begun to see her too, with a new and unsettling clarity, to understand the long secret purposes of the Bene Gesserit and the part she had played in them, and there was between them now a distance that had not been there before. The distance of a child who has glimpsed the machinery behind the world. Yet they were bound together still, more tightly than ever, the last two of their house, each the only family the other had left. And so they pressed on, deeper into the wasteland, toward the one hope that remained to them. For out in that trackless desert lived the Fremen, the hardened people of the sand, and Paul knew from Duncan Idaho's reports and from his own unfolding sight that among them lay whatever future House Atreides might still possess. In his visions he had glimpsed a face, a young woman with eyes made wholly blue by the spice, and though he had never met her, he felt he knew her, and dreamed of her, and understood that she waited somewhere ahead of him upon the road he was bound to walk. Chani, her name was, though he did not yet speak it, and toward her people, the desert was carrying him. They were hunted, grieving, and alone, two exiles in an ocean of sand. Yet the desert that had been meant to kill them was slowly claiming them instead, teaching them its ways, hardening them, remaking them into something the Baron Harkonnen had never imagined when he cast them out to die. The fall of House Atreides had not been its end. It had been, though none of its enemies could see it, the strange and terrible beginning of something far greater. And the boy who walked the dunes with a stilton on his back carried within him the seed of an empire yet unborn. Up next in Chapter 13, we will follow Paul and Jessica as they are found at last by the Fremen of Sietch Tabr and taken in beneath the leadership of Stilgar into the hidden world of the deep desert. In the vast silence after the fall of their house, Paul and his mother Jessica came at last upon the people they had crossed the desert to find. Out of the folds of the dunes, in the gray hour before dawn, a band of Fremen rose as if the sand itself had taken shape and breath. They were led by a man named Stilgar, a Naib of the deep desert, hard and weathered as stone, whose eyes carried the deep blue of a life steeped in spice. He had met Duke Leto once, in the days before the betrayal, and he remembered the boy and the woman as more than strangers. Yet the desert had its own laws, and nothing among the Fremen was given freely, for water was life, and life was measured in every drop a body carried within it. The Fremen did not welcome them at once with open arms. They tested them, as the desert tested everything. Jessica, trained through long years by the Bene Gesserit, moved faster than sight when one of the band reached for her, and she held him fast with a skill that startled the hardened warriors. Stilgar watched and understood that these two were not ordinary refugees. He saw in the mother a strange and formidable power, and in the boy something he could not yet name, something that stirred the old stories his people had carried for generations. And so, rather than leave them to the sand, he chose to bring them into the fold of his tribe, to the hidden place his people called Sietch Tabr. But there was one among the band who did not accept them so easily. A warrior named Jameis, proud and quick to anger, challenged the decision. By the ancient custom of the Fremen, a dispute of this kind could be settled only through the Tahadi challenge, a duel to the death upon the open ground. Paul, who had never taken a life, found himself bound by a code he barely understood, facing a seasoned fighter beneath the pale light of the two moons. The combat was slow and terrible in its way, for Paul had been trained by the finest swordsman of his father's house, yet he fought with an unfamiliar hesitation, unwilling to kill. When at last it ended, and Jameis lay still upon the sand, Paul wept, and the Fremen marked this well. For among a people who prized water above all things, tears shed for a fallen enemy were a gift almost beyond measure. That death opened the door to his new life. By taking the water of the fallen man, by observing the rites of the tribe, Paul earned his place among them. He was given names, as was the custom, for the Fremen believed a name held power and purpose. He chose for his secret sietch name the word Usul, which meant the strength at the base of a pillar, a name for the intimate use of the tribe. And he chose for his open name the word Muad'Dib, after the small desert mouse that lived where no other creature could survive, a creature clever and enduring, its shape said to be traced in the second moon. In this, the Fremen saw a sign, for their old prophecy spoke of one who would come, and the boy seemed to answer them without even trying. Jessica, for her part, took up a role of her own. The tribe had need of a reverend mother, a Sayyadina who could keep the deep memories and guide them in matters of the spirit, and the prophecies seeded long ago by the Bene Gesserit had prepared the way for a woman of her training. She carried within her another life as well, for she was with child, a daughter conceived in the last days of Caladan, and this too the Fremen came to regard with wonder and unease. Mother and son settled into the rhythm of the sietch, that hidden warren of chambers carved deep into the rock, sealed against the killing heat of the day, where a whole people lived unseen by the masters who believed they ruled Arrakis. Slowly, patiently, Paul learned the ways of the desert. He learned to wear the stillsuit as a second skin, that marvel of Fremen craft which reclaimed the water of breath and sweat and returned it, drop by precious drop, so that a person might walk for days across the sand and lose almost nothing. He learned the discipline of water, how every death added its measure to the tribe's hidden reserves, how the Fremen dreamed in secret of a green Arrakis, a world transformed across the long patience of generations. He learned to move without rhythm across the open sand, a broken and irregular step, so that the great worms of the deep desert would not be drawn to him by the steady drumbeat of an ordinary walk. And he learned the discipline of stillness, of waiting, of belonging to a place rather than passing through it. Among the people of Sietch Tabr there was a young woman named Chani, dark and fierce and sure of herself, a daughter of the desert, whose father had been the planetologist known to the Fremen as Liet. Paul had seen her face before he ever met her, in the strange dreams that had come to him even on Caladan, visions of a girl with eyes of deepest blue against the backdrop of an alien world. Now she stood before him in the waking world, and the meeting felt to him like the closing of a circle long left open. She became his teacher in the small things and the great, showing him the hidden ways of the sietch and the secrets of survival. And in time, she became far more than a teacher, for a bond grew between them that neither the desert nor the coming storms would break. As the seasons turned, the change in Paul deepened. He was no longer the pale air of a distant ocean world, but a young man of the desert, lean and watchful, his own eyes darkening toward the blue within blue that marked those who lived saturated in the spice. The melange was everywhere in the Fremen life, in their food, in the air of the sietch, woven into every hour, and it worked upon Paul in ways it worked upon no one else. His dreams grew sharper and more insistent, opening like corridors before him, showing him paths that branched and branched again into a future he could sense but not yet command. He walked among the Fremen as one of them, and yet a part of him stood always slightly apart, watching, weighing, aware of a great weight gathering on the horizon of time. For the prophecy was gathering around him now, quietly and steadily, as sand gathers against a stone. The Fremen watched the boy who had wept for his enemy, who had come out of the deep desert with his mother, who bore the names of strength and endurance, and among themselves they began to wonder whether the long-promised one had truly come at last, the voice from the outer world who would lead them to their dream. Jessica saw it too, and she saw how the seeds planted long ago by her sisterhood were blooming into something neither wholly false nor wholly within her control. Paul felt it settling upon him like a mantle he had not asked to wear, and he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that he could not set it down. And so the last son of House Atreides became a son of the desert, sheltered at last among a people who asked nothing of his lost titles and everything of his heart. In the hidden refuge of Sietch Tabr, surrounded by the patient endurance of the Fremen, he began to grow into something the Imperium had never imagined and would not be able to stop. But the desert had gifts still stranger to give him, and powers were stirring within him that even he did not fully understand. Up next in Chapter 14, Paul's visions and the water of life will follow the deepening of his strange gifts and the terrible transformation that would open the doors of memory and set him upon a path he could see but never fully escape. In the hidden warrens of Sietch Tabr, as the seasons of the desert turned one into another, Paul Muad'Dib came slowly into the fullness of his strange inheritance. He had crossed the sands as a hunted boy and been reborn as a son of the Fremen, and now, saturated day by day in the omnipresent spice, he felt the boundaries of his mind widening in ways he could neither halt nor wholly welcome. The melange was in everything the Fremen touched, in their food and their drink, in the very air of the deep Sietch, and in a mind like Paul's, prepared by generations of Bene Gesserit breeding, it worked a subtle and relentless alchemy. Where another might have felt only heightened senses, Paul felt time itself begin to unfold before him like a great fan opening across the dark. His visions had begun long before, in the cool halls of Caladan, faint and troubling as half-remembered dreams. Now they came upon him with terrible clarity. He saw not one future, but many, countless threads of possibility branching and rebranching, some bright and some drowned in shadow. And he learned that his choices in the present sent ripples racing down those threads, closing some paths forever and opening others he would have given anything to avoid. He came to understand that he was not merely dreaming of what might be, but standing at the center of a web of consequence, and that the smallest act might tip whole worlds toward joy or ruin. This was a gift, and it was also a burden heavier than any young man should be asked to carry. For to see so far was to lose the mercy of not knowing. Again and again, in the deep places of his mind, one vision returned to him above all others. He saw a green and terrible banner carried across the stars. He saw legions marching in his name, worlds burning, countless multitudes dying beneath a war waged in the name of a Messiah wearing his face. It was a holy war, a jihad, spilling out from the sands of Arrakis to wash across the whole of the known universe. He recoiled from it with all the strength of his heart, and he searched the branching futures desperately for a path that might lead around it, some narrow way by which the slaughter might be avoided. Yet the more clearly he saw, the more he came to fear that the war was not a possibility, but a tide, and that even his own struggle against it might be one of the forces drawing it nearer. While Paul wrestled with the widening of his sight, his mother Jessica stood upon the threshold of a transformation of her own. The Fremen had need of a true reverend mother to hold the deep memories of the tribe, and the old one who carried that burden was nearing the end of her long life. Before she could die, she had to pass on the accumulated memory of all the reverend mothers who had come before her, an unbroken chain of lives reaching back into the mists of the past. This passing could be accomplished only through a rite both sacred and perilous. A rite that turned upon the most feared substance the Fremen possessed. They called it the Water of Life. The Water of Life was the liquid exhalation of a sandworm drowned in the deep desert, a poison so potent that it killed any ordinary person who drank it. Yet a woman trained in the disciplines of the Bene Gesserit could do what no other could. Reaching inward with absolute control over her own body, she could seize upon the poison as it entered her, altering its chemistry within her flesh, changing that which would kill into that which would awaken. Jessica took the fateful draught, and for a suspended moment she balanced upon the knife edge between death and revelation. Then, with a mastery honed through long years of training, she transmuted the poison, and the doors of ancestral memory swung open within her. In that instant, Jessica became a reverend mother of the Fremen, keeper of all the lives that had come before. But she carried within her another life as well, for she was still with child, the daughter conceived in the last days before the fall of her house. The awakening flooded not only through Jessica, but through the unborn girl within her, and the child, still in the womb, woke to the full torrent of ancestral memory before she had ever drawn breath. She would be born already ancient, already burdened with the voices of countless generations, a being the sisterhood had never intended, and would come to name with dread. The tribe now had its Sayadina, its keeper of the deep memory, and mother and unborn daughter alike had been changed forever by the terrible sacrament of the worm. For Paul, the transformation of his mother deepened the mystery that surrounded him. He felt the reverberations of what she had endured, and he began to understand that the same threshold awaited him, that somewhere along the branching paths of his future stood a moment when he too would have to face the water of life. The Bene Gesserit had bred across countless generations toward a single hidden goal, a being they called the Kwisatz Haderach, a male who could bridge space and time in his mind, who could look with both the male and the female eye into the deep well of memory and possibility that no reverend mother could face. Paul began to suspect, with growing and unwilling certainty, that he was that being, arrived a generation before the sisterhood had planned, unbidden and beyond their control. The knowledge settled upon him like the weight of the whole desert. To be the Kwisatz Haderach was to stand at the axis of the future, to see the paths spread out in every direction, and to bear the responsibility for choosing among them. He watched the Fremen gather around him, watched the old prophecies bend toward him as reeds bend toward water, and he understood that forces far larger than himself were moving him toward a destiny he had not chosen. His grandfather had been a lover of bulls, a man of blood and courage, and something of that fierce spirit lived in Paul still. Yet no arena he might have imagined could have prepared him for the vastness of the ground on which he now stood. He came to see that the sisterhood, for all their patience and all their cunning, had summoned a force they could not truly command, and that he himself was that force, awake now and beyond their reckoning. The thought brought him neither pride nor comfort, only the quiet gravity of one who has glimpsed the true dimensions of his own life. Night after night, in the quiet of the Sietch, Paul lay awake with the futures turning behind his eyes. He saw the faces of those he loved caught up in the coming storm. He saw Chani beside him through years of triumph and sorrow. He saw thrones toppled and an old order swept away. And always, at the edge of every bright path, he saw the shadow of the holy war, patient and inevitable, waiting for him to take one more step. He came to understand that his gift was also a trap, that to see the future was in some measure to be bound by it, and that the very act of trying to escape might be the thing that sealed his fate. And so Paul Muad'Dib, grew into the strange and lonely certainty of what he was becoming. He was still a young man of the desert, beloved of the Fremen, learning their ways and sharing their dream of a green Arrakis. But within him, a vast awareness had opened, an awareness that set him apart from every living soul, that let him feel the shape of things to come as surely as another might feel the wind upon his face. He stood at the center of a terrible future, one he could see in all its branching sorrow, and he knew that soon he would have to step forward and take up the role the desert had prepared for him. Up next in Chapter 15, The Rise of Muad'Dib, we'll follow Paul as he masters the great sandworms, unites the scattered tribes of the desert, and rises to become the legend the Fremen have awaited across the long patience of their history. As the years of exile turned upon the great wheel of the desert, Paul Muad'Dib rose among the Fremen from a sheltered refugee into something far greater, a leader and a legend woven into the oldest hopes of his adopted people. He had learned their ways one by one, patiently, until the ways of the desert were no longer lessons, but instincts. He wore the stillsuit as if born to it. He moved across the open sand with the broken, rhythmless step that hid a walker from the deep. He knew the discipline of water and the discipline of silence, and he had earned the trust of hard men who trusted almost no one. Yet one great trial still lay before him, a trial that every Fremen youth had to face in order to be counted a true man of the desert. He had to ride a worm. The great sandworms of Arrakis were the most fearsome creatures in the known universe. Colossal beings that swam through the deep sand as whales swim through the sea, drawn to any steady rhythm upon the surface, able to swallow a spice harvester whole. The Fremen called the greatest of them Shai Hulud, the old man of the desert, and they held the worms in a reverence close to worship, for the worms were the source of the spice and the guardians of everything the Fremen held sacred. To ride one was to master the desert itself. Using the hooked instruments they called maker hooks, a rider would summon a worm by planting a rhythmic thumper in the sand, then leap upon the vast passing back, pry open a segment of its armored hide, and hold it turned upward so that the creature would not roll and would rise toward the surface to protect its tender inner flesh from the abrasive sand. When Paul's day came, he went out into the open desert before the eyes of the tribe, and he called forth a maker larger than any the older men could remember. The size of it was taken at once as an omen. He ran alongside the moving mountain of its flank. He set his hooks, and he mounted it, and he rode the great worm across the dunes in the light of the sun, guiding it and mastering it and returning at last to his people, no longer a boy of the outer world, but a rider of the deep. From that day the Fremen looked upon him with a new certainty, for he had done in full measure what their tradition demanded, and he had done it upon a maker of legendary size, as though the desert itself had risen to answer him. The feat passed swiftly from mouth to mouth across the sea edges, growing with each telling until it took on the shape of legend. The elders who had watched the young men come of age for decades spoke of it as something apart, a thing that belonged less to the ordinary trials of the desert than to the old stories they told their children in the deep hours of the night. And Paul, who understood the power of such tales, let them run their course. For he knew that a people are bound as much by the stories they share as by the blood in their veins, and that every telling drew the tribes a little closer to the single purpose he was quietly shaping among them. With his place among them secured beyond all question, Paul began the slow and patient work of uniting the scattered tribes. The Fremen were many, spread across countless hidden sea edges in the deep desert, each with its own naib and its own fierce independence, and for generations they had endured the cruelty of their off-world masters by remaining hidden and divided. Paul saw in them a strength the Imperium had never suspected, A vast reservoir of hardened warriors who feared nothing, who could vanish into the sand and strike from nowhere, who dreamed of a free and flowering Arrakis. He moved among the Sietches, and everywhere the old prophecy seeded long ago went before him, so that the tribes were prepared to receive him even before he arrived. Slowly, tribe by tribe, the desert people began to look to a single figure, and the many became one. He trained them as no Fremen leader before him could have done, for he carried within him the accumulated skills of House Atreides, the arts of war handed down through his father's finest men. He taught them the weirding way, the swift and deadly combat disciplines his mother had first taught to him, and he forged the raw courage of the tribes into a weapon of terrible precision. Under his guidance, the Fremen began to strike, not in scattered raids but in coordinated campaigns, falling upon the spice harvesters and the strongholds of their oppressors and melting back into the desert before any counterblow could land. The masters of Arrakis, the cruel House Harkonnen, found their operations bleeding at every turn, their harvest dwindling, their soldiers vanishing into the sand, and they could not understand from where the blows were coming. For Paul understood, as no invader ever had, where the true power of Arrakis lay. The whole vast machinery of the Imperium turned upon the spice. Without it, the navigators of the Spacing Guild could not fold space, and without them, the stars themselves fell out of reach. The great houses depended upon it. The Bene Gesserit depended upon it. The Emperor upon his throne depended upon it. And all of it, every grain, came from the sands of this single world. Paul saw that whoever could threaten the spice held the whole universe by the throat, and the Fremen, hidden in the deep desert astride the very worms that made the spice, were the one force capable of making that threat real. He began to strike at the heart of the spice trade itself, and the tremor of it was felt across the light years. As his campaigns spread and his legend grew, the name Muad'Dib passed from Sietch to Sietch and beyond, whispered in awe and in fear. To the Fremen, he became more than a war leader. He became the fulfillment of their deepest longing, the one the old stories had promised, the voice from the outer world who would lead them out of bondage and make the desert bloom. Some among them named him the Mahdi, the one who would lead them to paradise. Some named him the Lisan al-Ghaib, the voice from the outer world foretold across the generations. His mother, now their reverend mother, tended the growth of the legend even as she watched it swell beyond anyone's power to check, for the prophecies her sisterhood had planted long ago were bearing a harvest no one had foreseen. Paul walked through it all with the vision of the future turning ceaselessly behind his eyes. He knew what the gathering of the tribes meant. He knew where the swelling of his legend would lead. Every triumph in the desert brought the shadow of the holy war one step nearer, and he could feel the great tide of it rising beneath his every choice. He had become the leader the Fremen needed, the legend they had awaited, the master of the worms and the terror of the spice. And yet a part of him grieved for every step, knowing that the very power he was gathering would one day burst its banks and pour across the stars in a flood of blood carried in his name. Beside him through it all stood Chani, fierce and steady, sharing his campaigns and his counsel, anchoring him to the human world even as the vast awareness within him threatened to carry him beyond it. In her presence he could still be Usul, the young man of the Sietch, and not only Muad'Dib, the legend. Yet even she could not follow him into the depths of what he saw, nor spare him the loneliness of one who knows what is coming. The tribes were united. The worms were mastered. The spice, the treasure of the universe, lay within his reach to threaten. All the pieces the desert had prepared were now in place, and Paul understood that the hour of his true testing was drawing near at last. Up next in Chapter 16, The Prophecy Fulfilled, we'll follow Paul as he faces the final threshold, drinks the water of life himself, and accepts the fearful destiny of the Lisan al-Gaib and the Kwisatz Haderach. Paul Muad'Dib had become all that the desert could make of him, a rider of the great worms, a uniter of the scattered tribes, a legend whispered across the sands and beyond the reach of the stars. Yet for all his power, one final threshold remained before him, a threshold he had glimpsed again and again in his visions and had long dreaded to cross. The branching paths of the future had narrowed until they seemed to converge upon a single terrible point, and he knew that to see clearly enough to guide his people through the storm to come, he would have to face the very ordeal that had transformed his mother. He would have to drink the water of life, the poison of the drowned worm, the substance that killed every man who had ever dared to taste it. For it was a truth among the Fremen and among the Bene Gesserit alike that a reverend mother could transmute the poison and survive, but no man had ever done so and lived. The place within the deep well of memory that the sisterhood could not look upon, the dark region no woman dared face, was the very place the Kwisatz Haderach was bred to enter. Across countless generations, the Bene Gesserit had guided their secret breeding program toward a single hidden purpose, the making of a male who could bridge space and time in his mind, who could gaze with both the male and the female eye into that forbidden depth and return whole. Paul had come to believe, with a certainty that both steadied and frightened him, that he was that being, arrived a generation early, unbidden and beyond the sisterhood's control. And so, at the hour appointed by his own foreseeing, Paul took the water of life into himself. The poison struck him down as it struck down all men, and for a span of days he lay as one dead, his body cold and still, his life balanced upon the finest edge between oblivion and revelation. Chani watched over him, and his mother watched, and the Fremen waited in the deep silence of the Sietch, uncertain whether their Mahdi had passed beyond them forever. In the depths of that trance, Paul journeyed where no man had ever gone and returned. He looked into the dark region within, and he saw. The barriers that had divided his sight fell away, and past and future opened before him as a single vast landscape, memory reaching back through all his ancestors, male and female alike, and foresight stretching forward across the branching ages to come. When at last he woke, he was changed beyond the measure of ordinary words. He had become the Kwisatz Haderach in full, the one who could be many places at once in his mind, who held within him the accumulated lives of all who had come before, and the shape of all that might yet be. He understood now the full pattern of things, the deep currents that moved the Imperium and the Sisterhood and the Guild and the great houses. He saw the trap that had destroyed his father laid bare in every detail. He saw the jealous hand of the Padishah emperor behind the ruin of House Atreides, and he saw the path by which the wrong might be answered. And still, at the center of it all, he saw the holy war, no longer a distant possibility, but a near and gathering certainty. And he understood that his awakening had not turned it aside, but had brought it closer than ever. This was the terrible burden of his gift. Paul had crossed the final threshold, hoping, in some hidden corner of his heart, to find among the countless futures one narrow path by which the slaughter might be avoided. Instead, he found that the crossing had made the war more certain, that his own power was itself one of the forces drawing it near. He saw the green banners carried across the stars in his name. He saw worlds burning and multitudes dying. He saw his own face become the face of a god to peoples who had never known him. And he understood that he could refuse none of it without unleashing something worse, that the very refusal to lead might loose a chaos more terrible than the war itself. The prophecy the Fremen carried, and the prophecy the Bene Gesserit had planted, had become one, and both now pointed to him. He accepted it. That was the true fulfillment of the prophecy, not merely the powers that had awakened within him, but the acceptance of the destiny they carried. For a lesser man might have possessed the gift and refused the burden, might have turned away from the weight of what he saw, and let the future unfold without him. Paul understood that such a refusal was itself a choice, and that the paths beyond it led only into deeper darkness. The true crossing of the threshold was not the drinking of the poison, terrible as that had been, but the willing embrace of all that came after. He took up the mantle of the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world the Fremen had awaited across the long patience of their history, and he took up the harder truth of the Kwisatz Haderach, the being the sisterhood had bred toward for uncounted generations. He would be their Messiah, though he knew what a Messiah's coming would cost. He would lead the Fremen out of bondage and toward their dream of a green Arrakis, though he knew the road ran through fire. He had wept once for a fallen enemy in the light of the two moons, and now he would carry the weight of countless deaths he could see and could not fully prevent. And he took that weight upon himself with open eyes. Around him the desert stirred with a new and gathering force. The tribes were united beneath his name. The worms were his to ride into war. The spice, the treasure upon which the whole universe turned, lay within his power to threaten or destroy. And now the Fremen looked upon their Muad'Dib as more than a leader, more even than a legend. For he had done what no man had ever done, and returned from the water of life transformed. Every doubt among them fell silent. The old nabes who had once tested him now followed him without question. His mother, the reverend mother of the tribe, saw in him the awful flowering of everything her sisterhood had sought and everything they had feared to create. His sister, born already ancient from the womb, shared something of his terrible awareness. The pieces the desert had prepared across all the long years were now in place, and the hand that held them was Paul's. He stood upon the edge of the greatest reckoning the Imperium had ever known. Far away, the Padishah Emperor and his Sardaukar legions, the cruel masters of House Harkonnen, the watchful sisterhood and the fearful guild, all of them moved and schemed as they always had, believing the old order eternal. None of them yet understood that the young duke they had cast out to die in the sand had become the one force capable of bringing the whole vast edifice crashing down. Paul understood it fully. He had seen the shape of what was coming, and he had chosen, with sorrow and with resolve, to walk into it rather than around it, knowing that his triumph and his grief would be forever bound together. And so, the last son of House Atreides became the Messiah of the desert, the Lisan al-Gaib and the Kwisatz Haderach, the fulfillment of two prophecies bent across the centuries toward this single hour. He had crossed the final threshold and come back changed. He had accepted the holy war he could not escape. He stood now at the center of the future, no longer merely seeing it, but ready to seize it. And the storm he had foreseen for so long was gathering at last upon the horizon, waiting only for him to take the first step. Up next, in Chapter 17, we'll follow the war for Arrakis as it reaches its climax, the Fremen legions riding the great worms into battle, the shattering of the Harkonnen forces, and the Emperor himself brought at last to the desert world. The desert had waited a very long time for this hour, and when it came it did not arrive with trumpets, it arrived with wind. All across the deep sand of Arrakis, in the hidden sietches carved into the rock, and in the tents pitched below the dunes, the Fremen made themselves ready, in the old and patient way of a people who had learned to take everything the planet offered and waste nothing at all. They mended their stillsuits, tightening every seam so that the suits would drink back the sweat of the coming labor and give it once more to the body. They sharpened the crysknives grown from the teeth of the sandworms, holding the milky blades up to the failing light. They checked their maker hooks and their thumpers, and the small stores of water they carried. And they moved among one another with the calm economy of people who had rehearsed this in their dreams for longer than any of them had been alive. They spoke little, for words were water in their world, and there was nothing left now to say that had not already been decided in their hearts. Above them, gathered in the high country of the northern rock, the great storm of the season was rising. Paul, who was Muad'Dib to the tribes, and Lisan al-Gaib to the faithful, watched the wall of dust climb toward the roof of the sky, and he understood it the way he understood so many things now, as both a fact of weather and a moment already lived in the country of his visions. The Emperor Shaddam IV had come to Arrakis at last. He had brought his legions of Sardaukar, those terrible soldiers raised on the prison planet of Seleucia Secundus, and he had brought the great houses of the Landsraad in their ships, ringed above the desert in a fleet so vast it dimmed the stars. He had come because the flow of spice had faltered, because raiders no one could catch had been striking the harvesters for years, and because a name had begun to travel between the worlds that frightened him more than any army. He had come to end the trouble on the sand once and for all, and he did not yet know that the sand had been waiting for him. The city of Arrakeen lay below in its bowl of stone, its shield wall of rock standing between the settlements and the open desert, a barrier that had kept the worst of the storms and the worms away for generations. The Harkonnen forces and the Emperor's Sardaukar sheltered behind that wall, believing themselves safe within it, believing the desert to be an obstacle that a civilized power could simply endure. They had counted the Fremen as scattered bands of scavengers, a nuisance to be swept aside. They had never learned to count the desert itself. Paul had learned. He had learned every grain of it in the years since his house had fallen and he had been cast into the dunes to die. Now he gave the signal, and the Fremen brought out the family atomics, the ancient nuclear stones the Atreides had carried across the centuries, hoarded and hidden and never used. They were not turned against men. They were turned against the shield wall. In a single blinding instant, the rock that had sheltered Arrakeen for 1,000 years was broken open, and through the wound in the mountains came the storm, howling and vast, a rolling darkness of static and grinding sand that could strip the flesh from bone and blind the eyes of any machine. And riding before the storm, or rather riding within it, came the worms. They rose from the deep desert, as the Fremen called them, summoned by the drumming of the thumpers and by the will of men who had made friends with the most terrible creatures in all the known universe. The sandworms of Arrakis were mountains that moved, their mouths ringed with crystal teeth, their bodies longer than the tallest towers, and upon their broad gray backs rode the legions of the Fremen with their maker hooks and their banners, tens of thousands of them, silent and certain. They came out of the murk like the desert itself, rising up to reclaim what had been taken from it. The Sardaukar, who had never lost a battle that mattered, looked upon this and felt, perhaps for the first time in their hard lives, the cold touch of a fear they had no name for. The battle, when it broke, did not last as long as the fear of it. The storm swept away the Emperor's shields and grounded his aircraft and turned his ordered ranks into a scattering of men who could not see their own hands. The worms came through the broken wall, and the Fremen came with them, and they fought with the desperate joy of a people who had been promised this day by prophecy and had chosen at last to believe it. They had spent their whole history being underestimated, and now they turned that long insult into a weapon. The Harkonnen soldiers who had lorded over Arrakeen were were swept aside. The Sardaukar fought as they had been bred to fight, without mercy and without retreat, and still they were overrun, for no discipline could stand against the desert when the desert had finally decided to move. Paul watched it unfold from the high rocks, and there was no triumph in his face. He had seen this moment countless times in the visions that had haunted him since he first tasted the spice, and seeing it now with his waking eyes brought him no comfort. He knew what victory here would set loose. He had drunk the water of life and looked down the narrow paths of the future, and he had seen the banners of his name carried out beyond Arrakis, across the bridges of folded space, to worlds whose names the Fremen did not yet know, and he had seen the oceans of the dead that would be raised in his honor. He stood at the edge of that flood now, and the battle before him was only the first wave of it. By the time the storm began to spend itself and the sand settled back towards stillness, it was finished. The banner of the Emperor no longer flew freely over Arrakeen. The Harkonnen grip on the planet, held so cruelly and for so long, had been broken in a single day. The Sardaukar who survived were prisoners or scattered fugitives, and the great fleet above could only watch, unable to bring its power to bear against an enemy that fought inside the very weather. The Emperor Shaddam IV, ruler of 1,000,000 worlds, sat in his tent within the ruin of the city he had come to command, and he understood that he had been beaten by the one thing his machines and his soldiers and his careful plans had never accounted for, which was the patience of a hardened people and the will of a young man he had helped to make. Paul came down from the rocks as the light softened toward evening. Around him the Fremen were already at their solemn work, gathering their dead and, with a tenderness that outsiders never understood, reclaiming the water of the fallen for the tribe, so that even in death each life gave something back to the whole. The great worms had withdrawn again into the deep, sinking beneath the dunes as though they had never been, leaving only the long marks of their passage across the reddened sand. The desert was quiet once more. It had done what it had waited so long to do, and now it rested, indifferent and immense, beneath a sky going slowly to violet. And Paul stood among his people, victorious and sorrowful at once, a young man who had lost his father and his home and had gained in their place a planet and a prophecy and a future he could see, but could not stop. The war for Arrakis was won. Yet he understood, better than anyone alive, that winning the sand was only the beginning, and that the true reckoning still lay ahead. In a tent where a fallen emperor waited to learn the price of everything he had done. Up next, in Chapter 18, The Fall of the Padishah Emperor, we'll follow Paul into the presence of Shaddam IV, where an empire built over 10,000 years comes at last to the edge of its ending. In the quiet after the storm, within the broken city of Arrakeen, the powers of the known universe gathered under a single roof to reckon with what the desert had done. The great hall had been made ready, its floors still gritted with the sand that no cleaning could ever fully drive from a building on Arrakis. There, seated in captivity, was the Padishah Emperor Shaddam, the fourth of House Carino, who had ruled 1,000,000 worlds from the golden thrones of Kaitain, and who now waited to answer to a young man he had once meant to erase from history without leaving so much as a name behind. Paul came before him, surrounded by the Fremen, and the contrast in that room was itself a kind of judgment. On one side stood the emperor with the last of his household, the surviving officers of his Sardaukar, the truth-sayer of the Bene Gesserit at his shoulder, and the members of the great houses who had followed him to Arrakis expecting to witness a punishment and had instead witnessed a wonder. On the other side stood the desert people in their patched stillsuits, their eyes the deep blue of those who had lived their whole lives breathing spice, calm and watchful and utterly unafraid. Between the two stood Paul, who belonged now to both worlds and fully to neither, the son of a murdered duke and the messiah of a people the Empire had never troubled to see. He spoke first of the past, of the trap that had been laid for his family. He named the truth that everyone in the room already knew, and no one had dared to say aloud, that the Emperor himself had lent his Sardaukar to the Harkonnens, disguised in Harkonnen colors, to fall upon House Atreides in the night and destroy it. He named the death of his father, Duke Leto, the just and beloved Lord of Caladan, who had been betrayed from within his own house and had died without ever raising his sword against those who murdered him. The Emperor did not deny it. There was no longer any purpose in denial, for the desert had stripped away every comfortable fiction, and all that remained was the plain shape of what had been done. He spoke of these things without heat, in the level voice of a man for whom the wound was old and the outcome already known, and the room listened in a silence that grew heavier with each measured word. Yet naming a crime was not the same as holding power, and the room still believed that power lay with the fleet above. The countless ships of the Emperor and the assembled houses ringed around the planet, carrying enough force to burn the surface of Arrakis to glass, gathered there in a ring of steel that had never in living memory been defied and lost. It was the oldest arithmetic of the Imperium that in the end, the greater fleet decided all things. Paul knew this arithmetic, and he knew the one number that broke it. He turned the conversation, gently and without haste, to the spice. All of it, every gram of the melange that extended life and expanded the mind, that let the navigators of the Spacing Guild fold space and carry humanity between the stars, came from this one desert world, and from nowhere else in the whole of creation. And Paul, who had become one with the Fremen and their worms and their most guarded secrets, held now the power to end it. He revealed that he could destroy the spice utterly, not for a season, but forever, by unleashing upon the sands a thing that would break the fragile cycle that made the melange at all. Without the spice, the guild would go blind. The ships would stop between the worlds. The Bene Gesserit would lose the sight that guided them. The wealthy would lose the long lives they had bought, and the great and delicate machine of the Imperium, 10,000 years in the building, would seize and fall silent forever. It was a threat that no fleet could answer, for a fleet could destroy Arrakis, but destroying Arrakis destroyed the spice just the same. And so the very weapon the Emperor had brought became worthless in an instant. The truthsayer at his side confirmed with dread that the young man meant every word and had the means to do it. In that moment, the balance of the universe, which had rested for 100 generations upon fleets and thrones and the old certainties of noble blood, quietly turned upon a single man standing in a sandy hall in his dead father's borrowed strength. Into this reckoning stepped the last defense of House Carino, for the Harkonnens had brought forth their finest, the young Nabaran Fade Rautha, a gladiator raised and honed for exactly such a moment. He offered himself as the Emperor's champion, and by the ancient laws that even Paul could not simply set aside, the challenge had to be met in single combat, blade against blade, with the canley of the great feud between Atreides and Harkonnen finally to be settled body to body. The two young men faced each other with their crysknives, one bred in cruelty and appetite and the pleasure of pain, the other forged in loss and the desert and the terrible clarity of prophecy. The duel was told among the Fremen ever after in low and reverent tones. It was close, closer than the legends like to admit, for Fade Rautha was swift and clever and fought with a hidden treachery, a poisoned spur meant to steal the victory by a trick. Paul, who had seen so many futures, had not been able to see this one clearly, for his rival stood in a blind spot of his vision, and so he met it not with foreknowledge, but with everything his father's men and his mother's sisterhood had ever taught him. In the end, it was Paul who stood, and the last champion of the Harkonnens who lay upon the sand, and the long feud that had haunted two houses across generations was ended at last with a quiet that felt less like triumph than like an old wound finally closing. Now there was nothing left between Paul and the throne. The Emperor Shaddam IV, defeated in battle, exposed in his treachery, stripped of the one weapon that had made him master of the stars, had no move remaining. To bind the victory in the old way, and to give the new order a form the houses would accept, Paul demanded the hand of the Emperor's eldest daughter, the Princess Irulan, in marriage. It was not a union of the heart, and everyone in the room understood that. It was the taking of the throne itself, the joining of the Atreides name to the imperial line, so that Paul might sit where the Carino had sat, lawfully in the eyes of the Landsraad and beyond dispute. Shaddam IV, who had ruled longer than most men live, gave up the throne. He would be sent away to end his days upon the prison world of Seleucia Secundus, the very planet whose harshness had forged his terrible Sardaukar, and the golden age of House Carino, which had begun in the ashes of the war against the machines, came softly to its close in a room full of sand. The great houses looked upon the young duke who had unmade an emperor, and they saw their own future written plainly in his eyes, and some of them were already afraid. Paul stood at the center of it, and he did not smile. He had gained everything his enemies had once denied him, and he had felt, as he took it, the great door of the future swing open at his back. Beyond that door waited the thing he had dreaded since the first spice vision touched his mind. The flood he could no longer hold, gathering now in the hearts of the faithful who looked upon him not as a duke, but as a god. Up next in Chapter 19, Paul's Ascension and the Holy War. We'll follow the young emperor to his cold throne and watch the banners of his name carried out across the stars, in a victory shadowed by all that it unleashed. And so the young man from the ocean world of Caladan, who had lost his father and his home, and had wandered the deep desert as a fugitive, sat down upon the throne of the known universe. Paul Atreides, called Muad'Dib by the Fremen, and Lisan al-Gaib by the faithful, became the Padishah emperor in the place of the house he had toppled. He wore the authority as a man wears a garment cut for someone else, and though it fit him in the eyes of the law, it never once fit him in the quiet of his own heart. The forms of the old empire were kept, for empires survive by their forms. He took the Princess Irulan as his wife, and by that marriage he bound the Atreides name to the ancient Carino line and made his rule lawful in the sight of the Landsraad and the great houses. Yet the marriage was a treaty and nothing more. Irulan would be his empress in title, seated beside him at every ceremony of state, keeper of the records and the chronicles. And she would never be given his love, nor a child, nor a single tender hour that was not owed to the business of ruling. Paul had told her, in the plain and merciless honesty of a man who could see too far, that history would remember her as his wife, while his heart remained elsewhere. And he kept that promise with a coldness that was itself a kind of grief. For his heart belonged to Chani, the Fremen woman who had walked beside him through the desert years, who had fought at his side and taught him the ways of the sand and borne his children in the siege. She was his beloved and, in every way that mattered to him, his true wife, though the empire would grant her only the name of concubine. It was one of the many cruelties of his ascension that the world he had won forced him to wear a public marriage like a mask over the private one that was real, and that the woman he loved most had to stand a little apart from the throne so that the throne itself might stand. Paul understood the arithmetic of it, and understanding did not lessen the ache of it at all. But The deepest sorrow of his reign was not in the throne room. It was out beyond Arrakis, out beyond the sight of any single world, in the vast dark between the stars, where his name had begun to travel like a fire across dry grass. For the Fremen, who had waited so many generations for a Messiah to come from the outer worlds and lead them, now had their Messiah, and they would not be content to keep him only for themselves. They believed, with the whole of their hardened and faithful hearts, that the desert had at last brought forth the one who would carry their truth across creation. And they took up his green and black banner and poured off the sands of Arrakis into the ships of the Spacing Guild, and they went out to make the universe believe what they believed. This was the holy war, the jihad, that Paul had seen coming since the first spice visions troubled his sleep in the fortress of Arrakeen. He had glimpsed it long before he had the power to cause it, and he had spent years trying to find some path through the tangle of the future that might let him avoid it. He had searched every branch of what might be, and on nearly every branch the war was there, waiting, vast and terrible, fed by his own legend, whether he willed it or not. To refuse the throne would not have stopped it. To die would not have stopped it, for a martyr is an even brighter banner than a living man. The flood had a momentum older than his choices. Born of a religion the Bene Gesserit had seeded on Arrakis long ago, and of a people starved for centuries for exactly such a hope. So the war went out across the known worlds, and it was carried out in his name and under his sign, and there was very little that even an emperor could do to soften it. The Fremen legions descended upon planet after planet, and the great houses that resisted were broken, and the old order that had stood since the fall of the thinking machines was swept away in the name of Muad'Dib. Whole populations bent the knee to the new faith, or were made to. In the long count of it, across all the years the jihad burned, the dead were numbered in the billions, and the names of scores of worlds were struck from the living rolls of the empire. It was a victory beyond anything his father could have dreamed, and it was a horror beyond anything his father could have borne, and both of these things were true at the same time. Paul carried the weight of it in a way that few could see. To the faithful he was a God walking, the fulfillment of every promise, and they read his silences as wisdom and his sorrows as the burdens of the divine. But within himself, he knew that he had become the vessel of a force he could ride and could not steer. A man who had reached for prophecy as a shield against his enemies, and had found it to be a current sweeping him and all of humanity toward a destination he had never chosen. He had become the Kwisatz Haderach, the one the Bene Gesserit had bred their long centuries to produce, the mind that could look in every direction at once through the corridors of time. And the terrible gift of that sight was that he could see the suffering his own legend caused, and could see, too, that the alternatives his visions offered were often darker still. He learned, as the years of his reign wore on, that a god is the loneliest of all prisoners, walled in by the very worship that raised him up, and that no throne in the universe is quite so cold as one built upon the certainty of others. The faithful brought him their devotion, and asked in return only that he be more than a man, and he gave them what they asked, and it cost him nearly everything that had once made him human. There were things he tried to hold back, small mercies within the great catastrophe. He kept faith with the Fremen, and honored the water of their dead, remembering the Sayach that had taken in a fugitive boy and made him one of their own. He worked to green the desert of Arrakis by slow degrees, dreaming with them of a day when open water might one day lie beneath their sky, though he knew even that dream carried a hidden cost for the worms and the spice they made. He governed as justly as a man may govern who sits atop a tide of blood shed in his name. And through it all he kept Chani near, and in the private hours they were granted He was not an emperor or a god, but simply a man who loved a woman and feared the future they were making together. For the future did not end with the jihad, and Paul knew it. His sight ran far ahead of the wars of his own lifetime, down the long roads of centuries yet to come. And there he had glimpsed a thing so strange and so demanding that he could scarcely bear to look upon it. He had seen a path that led through even greater darkness before it led at last to the survival of humankind. A narrow way that a man might have to walk, or that a man might have to refuse and leave to another. He had seen the shape of his own children within it, and a burden that would outlast his throne and his name, and the very memory of the Atreides as a family of flesh. It waited for him at the edge of every vision, patient as the desert itself. Up next, in Chapter 20, The Golden Path and What Came After, we'll follow the long thread of the story far beyond Paul himself, toward his children and the strange god-emperor who would come, and toward the vastness of sand and time in which it all comes gently to rest. The story does not end with Paul, though it would be gentle to imagine that it did. A man may win an empire and still find that the future he opened runs on far past the reach of his own life, carrying his blood and his burden into years he will never see. So it was with Paul Atreides, and to close the long tale of Dune, we must let our eyes lift from the throne room and follow the thread of it outward. Softly, across the great distances of time, Paul reigned for years as the Emperor Muad'Dib, and in those years, Chani gave him children. There were twins, a son named Leto and a daughter named Ghanima, born into a world already shaped by their father's legend. They were no ordinary children. They had wakened before their birth, roused by the spice that soaked the very air of Arrakis. And they came into the world carrying the memories of all their ancestors alive within them, aware and old in the way their grandmother Jessica and their father had become aware. The strange inheritance of a bloodline the Bene Gesserit had bred across 100 generations. Chani, who had given so much and asked so little, did not survive their birth, and Paul grieved for her as he had grieved for nothing else. For she had been the one wholly human joy of a life given over to prophecy. In time, Paul himself walked away from the throne. Blinded at last, and weary of the God the faithful had made of him, he did the thing a Fremen does when his usefulness to the tribe is ended. He walked out into the deep desert alone, into the sand that had made him and had waited so patiently for him, and he let it take him, so that his myth might live while the man could finally rest. He left his children to the future he had glimpsed and had not been able to bring himself to seize, that narrow and terrible road he had named the Golden Path. The Golden Path was the thread Paul had seen running through all the dark corridors of his sight, the single course by which humankind might survive across the depths of time. For his vision had shown him a far horizon on which the human race, grown fat and settled and dependent, might one day dwindle into a stillness from which it could never rise again, or might be found by some force from beyond the known worlds and simply swept away, undefended and unprepared. The Golden Path was the way through, a long and cruel discipline that would teach humanity, at a price almost too great to bear, never again to place its whole fate in one basket, never again to be led like a docile flock, never again to be so easily found and so easily ended. Paul had looked upon what that path would demand of the one who walked it, and he had turned away from it, unwilling to pay the price with his own soul. He left it, instead, for someone with the will to become something no longer quite human. That someone was his son. Leto II, born already ancient, took up the burden his father had set down. On the sands of Arrakis, he made a bargain that no ordinary man could have imagined, joining his living body with the small sand trout the young form of the great worms, until his flesh was slowly overtaken by their skin. Over long years he became a thing between man and worm, immensely strong, immensely long of life, neither wholly one creature nor the other. He gave up the shape of a man, and in exchange he gained the centuries, so that he might steer humanity down the golden path with a patience no mortal ruler could ever possess. Leto II became the God Emperor, and he reigned not for years, but for thousands of years, a span so vast that the empires and rebellions and generations of ordinary people rose and fell within it like waves upon a shore that does not change. He ruled with a heavy and deliberate hand, holding humanity still and constrained through age after age, gathering all its longing and its restlessness into a great coiled tension, so that when at last his long reign ended, the human race would burst outward across the stars in a scattering so wide and so wild that it could never again be gathered up and destroyed by any single power. He gave his whole immensely long existence to this one purpose, and he bore the loneliness of it and the sorrow of it across more time than any human heart was ever meant to hold. It was the fulfillment of the thing his father had seen and could not do, the cost of the survival of everyone who would come after. And so, the great pattern of Dune closes upon itself. It began in the ashes of a war against thinking machines, with the commandment that no mind should ever again be made in the likeness of a human mind. And it turned upon spice and sand and the patient sisterhood and the desert people who waited for a Messiah. It gathered into the fall of a noble house and the rise of a young man who saw too far. And it opened at last into a future so long and so strange that it passed beyond the life of any single soul, into the keeping of a son who gave up his very humanity to guide it. Through all of it ran one quiet truth, that the desert takes and the desert gives, and that time is wider and more patient than any empire raised upon it. Now the sand lies still under its violet sky, as it has lain for ages and will lie for ages more. The worms move slow and unseen in the deep, keeping their old secret. The wind smooths away the marks of every battle and every crown, until the dunes are clean again, as though none of it had ever happened, and as though all of it were happening still. Somewhere out among the countless stars, the descendants of those desert people carry a little of Arrakis with them, in their memory and in their blood, wherever they have gone. There is nothing more to fear in the story now, and nothing more that needs to be done tonight. The struggles are all long finished. The great choices have all been made, and made well enough that the human family endures, scattered safely across a sky too vast for any darkness to swallow whole. The Messiah has found his rest in the sand. The God Emperor has kept his long and lonely watch and been relieved of it at last. And the desert, which outlasts every ruler and every war, holds it all gently, the way sleep holds a tired mind, without judgment and without end. So let the timeline of Dune settle now into stillness, like sand drifting down through the quiet air, each grain finding its place without any hurry at all. Let the wars fade, and the crowns fade, and the names grow soft and far away. There is only the desert left, and the slow breathing of the wind across it, and the deep and patient peace of a world at rest beneath its stars. Everything that needed to happen has happened. Everything that needed to be told has been told. And there is nothing left to do but rest. Here at the end of the long story, on the warm and endless sand, under the turning and untroubled sky. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight, we followed the whole long timeline of Dune, from the ancient war against the thinking machines to the birth of the Imperium and its great houses. We learned of the Spacing Guild and the power of spice, of the Bene Gesserit and their secret breeding program, and of Arrakis, the desert planet, with its melange and its enormous worms. We met the Fremen of the deep desert and House Atreides of Caladan, and watched the Emperor's jealousy set a trap upon the sand. We saw the Handover of Arrakis, the betrayal and the fall of the Atreides, and a mother and son cast alone into the dunes. We followed Paul among the Fremen, his visions and the water of life, the rise of Muad'Dib and the prophecy fulfilled. And we came, at the end, to the battle for Arrakis, the fall of the Padishah Emperor, Paul's ascension and the Holy War, and the long golden path that stretched away beyond him. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those distant and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet desert at dawn. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.